Good evening, my friends. It is August 31st, 2025. Here in New York, the air carries the last warmth of summer, but also the first unease of autumn. The headlines whisper about strained supply chains, about trade deficits that grow heavier with every shipment, and about anxious debates in Washington over whether tariffs can protect or only wound. These concerns belong to our present age, yet they are echoes of older times. Tonight, as you rest and let your mind drift, we will walk together along a road that was never really a road. A web of paths stitched across mountains and deserts, where empires gambled fortunes and sometimes lost themselves. Close your eyes if you wish, and hear the faint jingle of camel bells under a starlit sky. The smell of spices carried on the wind, and the hushed bargaining of merchants whose voices once tied worlds together. The Silk Road has always sounded like romance, wealth, and mystery, but the truth was harsher. It was not a straight highway, but a vast network of routes shaped by ambition, fear, and chance. On one end, emperors of China draped their courts in shimmering silk, guarding the secret of its making as fiercely as modern companies guard patents. On the other, senators in Rome fretted that gold was flowing eastward too quickly, poured into fabrics so fine that they seemed indecent. Between them stretched thousands of miles of uncertainty, where caravans might vanish in sandstorms or fall, prey to bandits who demanded a toll in blood. Yet merchants returned again and again, because the prophets could ransom kings, and because what traveled along those paths was more than gold. The story begins in the Han Dynasty, when Emperor Wu sought not only to expand his borders, but to secure legendary horses said to sweat blood and carry men like the wind. His ambition carved corridors across Central Asia, and silk, paper, and lacquer began their long journey westward. In return came glass, gems, and techniques unknown to China. But openness brought danger. Raids from nomadic horsemen threatened the fragile frontier, proving that every global empire pays a price for connection. The Han wrestled with the same dilemma faced by powerful nations today, including America: how to reap the riches of exchange while guarding against the perils that ride in its wake. For Rome, the Silk Road became less a triumph than a temptation. By the 1st century of our era, millions of sesterces streamed eastward each year. Pliny the Elder complained that Rome was growing poor to clothe its women in extravagance, while emperors worried that luxury was weakening the state. The empire that prided itself on strength discovered what we might call a trade deficit, and with it came unease that foreign luxuries could corrode both treasury and soul. One cannot miss the echo in today's America, where arguments over imports from Asia and deficits measured in billions stir the same old fears of dependency. But the Silk Road was never only about wealth. Along its paths traveled monks and missionaries with faith and philosophy strapped to their backs. Buddhism crossed deserts into China and reshaped entire civilizations. Islam spread not only with armies but with merchants, and Christianity left its marks in faraway cities. Knowledge, too, moved across borders: astronomy, mathematics, medicine. Yet the road carried shadows with its gifts. The plague that struck Byzantium in the 6th century, and the Black Death that devastated Europe centuries later, both followed its trails. The lesson is cruel but enduring. Global connection brings salvation and ruin together. A truth Americans were reminded of when a virus spread faster than any caravan and humbled even the mightiest of nations. The 13th century brought a strange moment when the Mongols forged a vast empire that stretched from the Pacific to the Black Sea. Ruthless in conquest, they paradoxically created the safest era the Silk Road had ever known. This Pax Mongolica let merchants travel with confidence, and it carried Marco Polo all the way to the court of Kublai Khan. For a brief moment, the world was smaller than ever. But empires unravel, and when Mongol unity dissolved, thieves and rival lords returned, proof that trade depends not only on desire, but also on the sharp steel of political order. Even today, shipping lanes tremble under the threat of conflict, and the fragility of trade remains as real as it was 7 centuries ago. In time, the caravans gave way to ships. Explorers like Vasco da Gama charted new routes across oceans, and European empires shifted wealth from land to water. The Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, and English each built power upon the sea, and the old Silk Road faded into memory. Oceans became the stage for global commerce, and the lesson endures in our own century, where the United States maintains fleets in every ocean because it knows, as surely as Vasco did, that whoever controls the seas controls the world's wealth. The Silk Road story is not merely about silk or spices. It is about the rise and fall of empires bound by fragile threads of trade, about the risks of wealth that depends on distant strangers, and about how faith, ideas, and even plagues travel faster than armies. It reminds us that globalization is not new, but an ancient rhythm of desire and danger intertwined. And so, as America in 2025 argues about deficits, tariffs, and supply chains that stretch from Shenzhen to Seattle, the question lingers: have we learned more than the Romans or the Mongols ever did, or are we still walking the same ancient road, hoping wealth will flow in while peril stays out? Subscribe so that you do not miss the answer. When we begin the story of the Silk Road, it is tempting to imagine a grand design, a moment when rulers deliberately opened the world to trade and knowledge. Yet history rarely moves with such clarity. The Silk Road began more as a gamble, a desperate attempt by one empire to secure its survival. The Han dynasty in the 2nd century before Christ was powerful, but it was also encircled by threats. To the north and west, nomadic tribes known collectively as the Jiannu harassed Chinese borders with swift raids that neither walls nor armies could easily stop. Emperor Wu of Han, ruling from 141 to 87 BCE, understood that strength would not come only from numbers of soldiers, but from horses, those living engines of war. Chinese stock was hardy but small. Against the swift cavalry of the steppes, Han armies were often at a disadvantage. Stories reached the imperial court of a distant land, Fergana, where great horses sweated blood and galloped with divine power. For Emperor Wu, such horses were not luxuries, but necessities. To obtain them, he had to look beyond the horizon. The journey westward was no simple expedition. Envoys were dispatched across deserts and mountains, facing not only the fury of nature, but the hostility of tribes who saw them as intruders. Zhang Qian, perhaps the most famous of these envoys, spent years in captivity before he finally returned to court. Yet his journey was not in vain. He brought back maps, knowledge of distant kingdoms, and above all the possibility of alliances. What Emperor Wu had set in motion was not merely a military campaign but the opening of channels through which merchants would later flow. And merchants, unlike soldiers, did not retreat once battle was done. They followed profit wherever it might lead, and profit was abundant in silk. Silk was more than a fabric. In Han China, it was currency, a symbol of rank, a tool of diplomacy. It shimmered with prestige in a way no other material could match. When Chinese traders carried it westward, it became the key that unlocked doors in distant lands. Kings in Central Asia and Persia, accustomed to their own luxuries of gems and spices, found themselves captivated by the delicacy of silk. A yard of it could command the price of gold. Step by step, camel by camel, a trickle of trade became a river, and the gamble of Emperor Wu gave birth to something larger than he could have imagined. But every opportunity carried danger. The same paths that allowed silk to leave China allowed ideas and people to enter. With each caravan came the possibility of spies, raiders, or simply diseases unknown to the Middle Kingdom. The state spent heavily to secure frontier garrisons, and the treasury groaned under the weight of constant defense. A fragile balance emerged. The Han grew rich in trade, but wealth attracted enemies like moths to flame. The empire had to decide whether the gates to prosperity were worth the risk of letting peril slip inside. This tension is not unfamiliar to modern America. In 2025, debates in Washington echo strangely with those of Han China 2,000 years ago. The United States knows the riches of global supply chains. Its citizens clothe themselves in garments stitched in Bangladesh, use phones assembled in China, and sip coffee harvested in Latin America. Yet the same openness exposes vulnerabilities. A disruption in shipping lanes can leave store shelves empty, just as a raid on a caravan could leave markets barren in Chang'an. The Han Emperor faced the paradox of openness. To thrive, you must connect, but to connect is to invite risk, and the risks were not abstract. The northern steppes were alive with tension, and the Xiongnu raiders continued to test the empire's resolve. Emperor Wu's military campaigns against them were costly, draining both men and treasure. Victory never came easily, and even when it did, it rarely lasted. Much like the United States confronting cyber attacks or supply shocks in our own time, the Han Dynasty discovered that prosperity always comes at a price. The glitter of silk dazzled distant rulers, but behind its shimmer stood endless toil, the sweat of peasants, and the blood of soldiers. Thus the Silk Road began not as a vision of harmony but as a wager placed under duress. It was born of fear as much as ambition, out of the need to survive against enemies who rode faster and struck harder. Yet from that gamble grew a web that would stretch across continents, binding empires together in ways no one ruler could fully control. It was the beginning of globalization, long before the word was ever spoken. And just as Emperor Wu discovered, once you open the road, you cannot easily close it again. If you are still awake, leave a number 1 in the comments. The opening of the Silk Road during the Han Dynasty was not a single moment, but a series of costly experiments, each one demanding more of the empire than the last. Once Jiang Qian returned from his extraordinary mission, Emperor Wu was convinced that the riches and alliances of the West could tip the balance of power. Yet transforming knowledge into reality required something harder than dreams: infrastructure. The Han court poured resources into fortresses along the frontier, into garrisons that guarded narrow passes, and into roads cut across difficult terrain. Soldiers who had once been stationed in the fertile heartlands of the Yellow River found themselves exiled to desolate frontiers, watching over caravans rather than defending farms. To them, the empire's new policy seemed less like prosperity and more like endless hardship. The Silk Road demanded not only merchants and camels, but also a river of blood and silver to keep it alive. The logic of the gamble was clear. If China could reach distant kingdoms, it might bypass the stranglehold of the Xiongnu, those fierce horsemen who controlled much of the steppe. Silk could become a tool not only of wealth, but of diplomacy. A bolt of silk, gleaming in the sun, could secure alliances in Bactria or Sogdiana, regions that today we know as parts of Afghanistan and Uzbekistan. Yet every alliance was fragile. Central Asia was a mosaic of shifting loyalties, where one ruler might welcome Chinese envoys today and betray them tomorrow. Caravans could move under banners of friendship, only to be ambushed by those same supposed allies once they reached a desolate ravine. Merchants were pragmatic. If nothing else, they knew the dangers, but they also knew the profits. In China, a single caravan returning from the west could flood markets with jade, precious stones, or rare horses, lifting fortunes overnight. Families who had once been obscure could rise to prominence on the wealth of a single journey. But fortunes could vanish just as quickly. A sandstorm in the Taklamakan could bury men and beasts in minutes. bandits could slaughter a caravan too. The last man, tales of such disasters spread like ghost stories through taverns and markets. Yet they did little to dissuade those hungry for riches, to the ordinary people of Han China. However, the Silk Road often felt less like opportunity and more like burden. Taxes rose to pay for armies that marched endlessly westward. Farmers struggled under levies, while merchants, though wealthy, were often distrusted by officials steeped in Confucian suspicion of commerce. The very wealth the Silk Road created was unevenly distributed, and resentment festered. This dynamic should feel familiar to us today, for modern America too wrestles with the paradox of globalization. Supply chains bring cheap goods to store shelves, but the factories that once stood in towns across the Midwest lie shuttered. The wealth of trade often pools in the hands of a few, while the costs are borne by the many. Emperor Wu himself was a man of contradictions. He gloried in the grandeur of expansion, sponsoring military campaigns that reached deep into Central Asia. Yet he left behind an exhausted treasury. Historians note that by the end of his reign, the Han state was nearly bankrupt, drained by both wars and the effort to sustain long-distance trade. Silk, that shimmering fabric, was at once a lifeline and a poison. It opened doors, but it also demanded sacrifices that strained the empire to breaking. When he died in 87 BCE, the empire inherited both the glory of wider horizons and the burden of debt and insecurity. One might pause here and consider the irony. The Silk Road, celebrated as a symbol of wealth and culture, was from the beginning a story of imbalance. The riches it promised always came attached to hidden costs. Empires are rarely honest about those costs until they can no longer be ignored. In this, the Han Dynasty offers a mirror to our own time. The United States enjoys the marvels of global commerce smartphones, cheap clothing, abundant goods, but beneath the surface lies a growing unease about debt, about the fragility of supply lines, and about whether prosperity is being bought at the price of long-term stability. The gamble of the Han Dynasty reminds us that trade is never only about goods. It is about power, about survival, and about the risks that come when a state ties its fate to forces beyond its control. For Emperor Wu, horses were the prize, but what he unleashed was something much greater. The Silk Road was no single path, but a web that would entangle empires for centuries. It was an opening that could never again be closed. If you are still awake, leave a number 1 in the comments. The opening of the Silk Road was not just about caravans and commerce. It was also about how a society reshaped itself to bear the weight of such an undertaking. Within the Han Dynasty, the pressure of sustaining far-flung connections forced the state to reorganize its economy and its people's lives. The imperial treasury, already strained by decades of military campaigns, had to find new ways to extract resources. Taxes on farmers grew heavier, and state monopolies on salt and iron were enforced with ruthless efficiency. These industries, essential for both daily life and warfare, became instruments of imperial survival. The very tools that plowed the fields and forged the weapons were drawn into the great gamble of the Silk Road. Ordinary peasants felt this weight acutely. Archaeological records and Honira inscriptions tell us of households reduced to ruin, their men conscripted into distant garrisons, and their fields left untended. A farmer in the Yellow River Basin might never have seen a horse from Fergana, or a bolt of silk bound for Persia. Yet his labor, his taxes, and sometimes his very life, were demanded to sustain the emperor's vision. The Silk Road promised glory at the edges of empire, but often delivered hardship at its heart. And when famine struck, as it did during cycles of poor harvests, resentment against the court deepened. At the same time, new social tensions emerged. Merchants, long distrusted by Confucian scholars, grew rich from trade. The old ideal that the noblest man was a farmer who tilled his own land was undermined by the spectacle of traders returning from the West with fortunes that dwarfed the incomes of aristocrats. Court officials grumbled about the corrupting influence of luxury, echoing the complaints of Roman senators across the world, who made similar accusations centuries later. Yet the state could not abandon the merchants, for it relied on their daring and their caravans. Thus the Silk Road blurred old hierarchies, unsettling the balance of society in ways that would never fully be undone. Even within the court itself, debates raged. Was the endless drain of coin and manpower justified by the gains? Some ministers warned that the empire was bleeding itself dry for the sake of distant alliances and luxuries. Others insisted that only by pressing forward could Han China remain strong against the Jiannu and other rivals. Emperor Wu, proud and unyielding, sided with expansion, but his successors would inherit an empire strained by his decisions, and the consequences of overreach would haunt the dynasty for generations. The lessons are not lost on us today. In America of 2025, leaders grapple with similar questions, though dressed in the language of budgets and trade policy rather than silken horses. Should billions be poured into securing global supply chains, into subsidizing industries and maintaining overseas commitments? When roads and bridges at home crumble and households struggle with rising prices, the debate mirrors the arguments of the Han court. To some, global engagement is a lifeline. To others, it is a dangerous indulgence that weakens the core of the nation. The parallels are uncanny, a reminder that history rarely repeats exactly, but it often rhymes. There is another dimension to consider. The Silk Road did not only bring foreign goods to China, it also carried China outward into the imagination of others. In Central Asian bazaars, Chinese silk became a symbol of refinement. Much as today American technology or culture carries symbolic weight far beyond its borders, reputation itself became a kind of power. Yet reputation is fragile. A single defeat, a caravan destroyed, or a policy gone wrong could tarnish the prestige built at such cost. For the Han, the Silk Road was both an advertisement of glory and a target for resentment. By the close of Emperor Wu's reign, the contradictions were clear. The empire was larger, richer in influence, and more connected than ever before. But it was also brittle, exhausted by war, and dependent on forces it could not fully control. Trade had bound the Han dynasty into a larger world, but in doing so, it had exposed vulnerabilities that even the mightiest emperor could not escape. This duality, strength and fragility, entwined us at the heart of the Silk Road story, and it is why its lessons matter still. For every nation that has ever reached outward, whether Han China or America today, the same question lingers. How much can you open yourself to the world before the world begins to pull you apart? If you are still awake, leave a number 1 in the comments. As the Silk Road took shape under the Han, its existence reshaped not only economies, but also the imagination of the empire. To the people of Chang'an, the capital, caravans, setting out westward, were both a source of fascination and of dread. They represented possibility, but also peril. The city's markets were filled with whispers of strange lands, kingdoms ruled by distant kings with customs unlike anything known in China. Objects that returned from these journeys became symbols of wonder: jade from Khotan, grapes from Fergana, even stories of lands where rivers froze solid in winter. Yet every story of marvel was shadowed by another of tragedy. Families could wait years for news of a son who had gone west with a caravan, and often the only message that returned was silence. For the court, the Silk Road offered prestige that could not be measured in coin alone. Diplomatic envoys bearing silks were received in Central Asian courts as emissaries of a powerful empire, and this aura of wealth enhanced China's standing. But prestige came at a cost. Maintaining garrisons in the Gansu corridor and securing the Hexi region required endless streams of manpower. Archaeological remains tell us of forts spaced like beads along the desert's edge. Lonely outposts where soldiers endured bitter winters and searing summers. For many of these men, the road was not a tale of prosperity, but of exile. They guarded merchants they would never become, protected goods they would never afford, and fought battles for ambitions that gave them little in return. The imbalance between sacrifice and reward deepened over time. The elites of the empire draped themselves in wealth, while the burdens fell heavily on peasants and soldiers. This dynamic is strikingly familiar to Americans in 2025, who see the benefits of global supply chains accrue to corporations and coastal elites, while many small towns bear the scars of vanished industries, just as the Han farmer shouldered taxes to support faraway campaigns. Today's working families shoulder the disruptions of outsourcing and automation, often without sharing in the wealth their labor indirectly sustains. The Silk Road, ancient though it is, mirrors the inequalities of modern globalization. Yet even within hardship, there were moments of cultural brilliance. The steady trickle of foreign goods and ideas stimulated art, music, and even cuisine. Grapes and pomegranates entered Chinese orchards, altering diets that had once been based on millet and rice alone. Glasswork from the West inspired local artisans, while Central Asian styles left subtle marks on Chinese sculpture and textiles. Chang'an became not only a political capital, but a cultural crossroads, buzzing with influences that foreshadowed the cosmopolitan age to come under the Tang dynasty centuries later. This paradox of enrichment amid suffering is one of history's constant refrains. Hardship for some, creativity and wealth for others. Still, the empire's vulnerabilities deepened. Emperor Wu's constant wars against the Xiongnu drained the treasury. In 89 BCE, the cost of campaigns had risen so high that officials proposed new taxes on everything from property to household slaves. Records tell us that resentment brewed as people saw their wealth vanish into the maw of endless wars. Discontent spread quietly, and though the dynasty endured, it did so under a growing weight of exhaustion. Expansion had brought prestige, but it had also created obligations that could not easily be sustained. The road, once imagined as a highway to prosperity, was revealed as a double-edged blade. It brought wealth and knowledge, but it also required perpetual vigilance. The lesson here is timeless. The more a state reaches outward, the more fragile its inner core can become. For America today, the same dilemma looms. Its global commitments, from military bases abroad to the defense of shipping lanes, secure prosperity, but also drain resources that might otherwise renew infrastructure at home. The balance between external ambition and internal strength is one every great power must negotiate. And the Han struggles remind us how perilous that balance can be. By the end of Emperor Wu's reign, the empire had stretched further than any Chinese ruler before him could have imagined. Its influence extended into Central Asia. Its silk had become coveted across continents, and its name carried weight in lands far beyond its sight. Yet beneath the surface, cracks had formed. Exhausted soldiers, overtaxed peasants, and strained treasuries all whispered of limits that no glory could erase. The Silk Road had been born in triumph, but it carried within it the seeds of weakness. The paradox is haunting. To connect with the world is to be changed by it, sometimes in ways no emperor intends. The Silk Road was not only a road of silk, but a road of burdens, of promises made in gold and kept in blood. And like so many gambles of history, it left behind a legacy both dazzling and costly, one that continues to echo across centuries. If you are still awake, leave a number 1 in the comments. By the final decades of Emperor Wu's reign, the Silk Road had become both triumph and torment. On the surface, China stood taller than ever, its influence stretching deep into Central Asia. Its name carried far beyond the deserts and mountains. Foreign envoys arrived in Chang'an bearing gifts and tribute. a visible sign that the world recognized the empire's stature. Silk had become the lifeblood of diplomacy, a fabric that no other land could produce, and one that bound distant rulers into webs of obligation. The shimmering cloth that draped emperors and adorned palaces was more than fashion. It was currency, weapon, and symbol. Yet beneath the splendor, the foundations of the Han dynasty creaked under the strain of sustaining such far-reaching ambitions. The cost of maintaining garrisons along the Gansu corridor and protecting the Hexi region grew intolerable. Soldiers stationed there lived in isolation, their lives defined by monotony and hardship. Their letters, fragments of which survive on bamboo slips, unearthed by archaeologists, reveal men desperate for home, men whose service stretched year after year with little relief. Many never returned. For them, the Silk Road was not romance but exile. The empire's glory demanded their lives, and the debt was rarely repaid. Families left behind struggled without their sons or fathers, their harvests failing without labor, their taxes still demanded by an empire that seemed deaf to their suffering. The treasury, too, groaned. Emperor Wu's military campaigns had expanded China's borders to an unprecedented extent, but they had also emptied coffers. By the end of his reign, the court faced financial crisis. New taxes on land, property, and even household slaves deepened resentment. Officials debated the wisdom of policies that had enriched a few, but impoverished many. The emperor, who had been hailed as a conqueror, left behind a state that was weary, strained, and unsure whether its gains outweighed its losses. The lesson was written in stark relief. An empire cannot stretch endlessly outward without paying the price inward. Yet, paradoxically, the Silk Road also seeded a cultural transformation. The flow of goods and ideas began to change the fabric of Chinese life itself. Grapes and alfalfa, introduced from the West, altered diets and farming practices. Artifacts revealed designs influenced by Central Asian motifs. Even music began to absorb foreign rhythms, creating a blend that reflected the interconnectedness of the age. In this sense, the hardships of the frontier birthed a cultural richness that would echo for centuries. The people might have groaned under taxes and conscription, but they also lived in a world where horizons had expanded, where foreign wonders touched daily life. This tension between suffering and enrichment would remain one of the Silk Road's central paradoxes. Looking back, one can see how fragile the arrangement always was. A single drought, a single rebellion, or a single shift in trade could tip the balance. For all its power, the Han dynasty discovered that global connection made it more vulnerable, not less. The very act of reaching outward bound the empire to distant events it could not control. When caravans failed to arrive, when alliances faltered, when costs rose higher than revenues, the road that had promised prosperity became a source of anxiety. This is a rhythm familiar to Americans in 2025. The United States, like Han China, is bound to a global network that brings riches, but also fragility. A ship stuck in a canal, a conflict in a distant region, or a pandemic sweeping across borders can ripple instantly through households in Ohio or California. Supermarket shelves can empty overnight, gas prices can soar, and ordinary families feel the tremors of events half a world away. Just as the Silk Road linked the fates of the Han dynasty to distant kingdoms, today's supply chains link the fate of America to ports and factories scattered across the globe. The question, then as now, is whether the benefits outweigh the vulnerabilities. The story of the Han dynasty's gamble reminds us that globalization is never free. It demands sacrifices, often from those least able to bear them. It enriches some while burdening others. And yet, once the door is opened, it cannot easily be closed. Emperor Wu set his empire on a course that would shape centuries, for better and for worse. The shimmering promise of silk drew China into a larger world. but it also entangled it in challenges that no emperor could fully master. The gamble defined not only his reign but the destiny of his dynasty. And so, as we conclude this first chapter of the Silk Road's tale, we see clearly that it was born not of harmony, but of necessity, not of prosperity alone, but of sacrifice. It was, at its heart, a wager placed against uncertainty, one that brought both dazzling triumphs and enduring pains. The echoes of that wager reach us still, in every debate about borders, trade, and security. History may not repeat itself, but its rhythms continue to hum beneath the surface of our lives. If you are still awake, leave a number 1 in the comments. When silk finally reached the Roman world, it arrived not with quiet dignity, but with scandal. 2 Roman senators, the fabric was almost otherworldly, so delicate and translucent that it seemed to mock the rougher textures of wool and linen that clothed most of the empire. Women of status draped themselves in gowns that shimmered in candlelight, and soon even men sought silk to mark their wealth. Yet what glittered on the bodies of Rome's elite carried with it a darker story of money vanishing eastward, never to return. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century of our era, fumed that Rome was spending 100 million sesterces every year on imports from India, Arabia, and China, with silk the chief culprit. He described the empire as bleeding gold, enriching distant lands while impoverishing itself. His words were not just complaint, but warning. A great empire could be undone, not by legions lost on the battlefield, but by the slow drain of its treasure, across invisible trade routes. The paradox was painful. Rome prided itself on self-sufficiency, boasting of fertile lands in Egypt that fed its people, and mines in Spain that filled its coffers. Yet the desire for luxury proved insatiable. Senators debated whether wearing silk corrupted Roman morals, claiming that garments so sheer weakened virtue and discipline. The moralists raged, but fashion triumphed. To wear silk was to declare power, to show that you had access to wealth that most of the world could scarcely imagine. And once that taste took root, it could not easily be abandoned. Rome was caught in a cycle it did not fully understand. The more it consumed, the more dependent it became on distant suppliers beyond its control. The roads and sea lanes that carried silk to Rome were long and treacherous. Goods traveled through Central Asia, across Persia, into Syrian markets, and finally into the great bazaars of Antioch and Alexandria. From there, merchants ferried them to Rome itself. Every hand that touched the fabric along the way demanded a profit, so that by the time silk reached the empire's heart, its price had multiplied many times over. And yet demand did not falter. In an empire where status was everything, where senators competed to outshine each other at feasts and games, silk became a badge of superiority. Even emperors wore it, though some tried to forbid it for others, insisting it should remain a privilege of the throne. Such prohibitions failed, for the appetite of Rome was stronger than any law. What is striking is that Romans often misunderstood silk itself. Many believed it grew on trees in the east, harvested like fruit by mysterious peoples beyond the edge of the known world. The secrecy of Chinese producers, who guarded the methods of sericulture with absolute vigilance, fed these fantasies. This ignorance made silk seem even more exotic, more magical, and thus more desirable. In truth, it was the labor of countless Chinese peasants, women raising silkworms and weaving thread into cloth, that sustained Rome's addiction. The wealth of the empire was pouring into the hands of strangers whose names the Romans did not know and whose lands they could not conquer. This pattern of wealth flowing outward, while dependency grew inward, is one that resonates today. In America of 2025, critics argue that the nation's reliance on imports, from microchips to rare earth minerals, creates vulnerabilities similar to Rome's. Factories long closed in Michigan or Ohio stand as silent witnesses to the shifting balance of global trade. Just as Romans discovered that their prosperity depended on caravans and ships beyond their reach, Americans now realize that the lifeblood of modern technology can be cut off by decisions made in Taiwan, Shenzhen, or elsewhere. The anxiety of Rome, voiced by Pliny 2,000 years ago, finds its echo in congressional hearings and economic reports today. For the ordinary people of Rome, however, the debate over silk felt distant. Bread and grain mattered more than translucent robes. Yet there was a cost all the same. As gold drained eastward, the empire had to replenish its treasury. Taxes grew heavier, levies were enforced with greater brutality, and the gap between the wealthy and the poor widened. While patricians draped themselves in shimmering cloth, plebeians struggled in crowded apartments, their lives untouched by the luxuries that hollowed the empire's wealth. The resentment simmered, unspoken but real, and in that resentment lay the seeds of unrest that would haunt Rome in the centuries to come. Thus, the arrival of silk in Rome was not merely a tale of trade. It was a mirror of the empire's strengths and weaknesses. It revealed how wealth could seduce, how desire could drain even the mightiest treasury, and how the pursuit of luxury could mask deeper vulnerabilities. The Roman Empire, for all its legions and its laws, could not stop the flow of gold to the east, and once that flow began, it could never truly be reversed. If you are still awake, leave a number 1 in the comments. Rome's obsession with silk did not exist in a vacuum. It unfolded in an empire already struggling to balance wealth and discipline. The Romans prided themselves on their practicality, their roads and aqueducts, their legions and laws. Yet when silk arrived, it exposed a weakness that no engineer could pave over: the hunger for luxury that gnawed at the heart of empire. This hunger is vividly described by Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, who scolded his contemporaries for clothing themselves in fabrics so thin they left little to the imagination. To him, silk symbolized moral decay, a sign that Rome was losing the rugged simplicity that had built its greatness. The warnings were as much about the soul as about the treasury, but they reveal how deeply the foreign cloth unsettled Roman identity. Behind the debates about morality lay a harsher reality. The money had to come from somewhere. Rome did not produce silk. Every shimmering garment represented gold or silver leaving the empire. Coins, minted in mines from Spain to Gaul, carried eastward along caravan trails. The flow of wealth was so vast that officials feared shortages of bullion. An empire that had once seemed endlessly rich now confronted the uncomfortable truth that it was financing the prosperity of others. The East was not conquered by Roman legions, yet it profited more from Rome's wealth than some provinces within the empire. This imbalance was not merely economic, it was psychological. The thought that Rome might depend on strangers unsettled a people who saw themselves as masters of the known world. Trade routes through Parthia only deepened the tension. The Parthian Empire, Rome's rival in the east, acted as middleman in the silk trade, extracting enormous profits. Roman merchants rarely reached as far as China, and Chinese traders rarely came west beyond Persia. In between stood Parthia, controlling the choke points, dictating the prices, and reaping the rewards. For Rome, every bolt of silk was a reminder, not only of its dependence, but of its inability to dominate the entire trade system. Military campaigns were launched into Mesopotamia, not only for glory but to break this economic stranglehold. They failed more often than they succeeded. Crassus, one of Rome's richest men, marched against the Parthians in 53 BCE, dreaming of conquest. At Carrhae, his legions were destroyed, his own life ended in disgrace, and Parthia's control of the trade routes remained unbroken. The Silk Road, in this sense, became another battlefield where Rome's might could not secure supremacy. For the common citizen, these struggles played out in subtler ways. The empire's appetite for luxuries encouraged higher taxes, and the burden fell. disproportionately on those least able to pay. Bread remained cheap enough to stave off starvation, thanks to the grain fleets from Egypt, but life grew harder for artisans and farmers. The wealth that flowed eastward did not circulate back to them. Instead, it accumulated in the hands of elites who flaunted their silk robes and marble villas, symbols of a gap between rich and poor that widened dangerously. The historian Tacitus, writing in the 1st century, described Rome as a place where extravagance coexisted with misery, where opulence blinded the ruling class to the realities of the people. In this widening gap, we can glimpse reflections of America in 2025. The United States, like Rome, is an economic giant that imports more than it exports. Just as Roman senators complained of bullion draining away, modern economists debate trade deficits measured in trillions. Critics argue that the country is sending its prosperity abroad, financing the rise of competitors while hollowing out its own industrial base. Towns once thriving with factories now stand quiet, much as Roman provinces once rich with bullion saw their wealth shipped east. And just as Rome's elite draped themselves in silk while commoners bore heavier burdens, so too do Americans witness vast inequalities in wealth, where luxury is concentrated among a few, while the many struggle with rising costs of living. The strain was not merely financial. Rome's armies, the backbone of its power, required steady pay and steady supply. Gold flowing outward left less for soldiers' wages, and discontent brewed in the ranks. Mutinies and unrest, scattered but significant, reflected the growing fragility of the imperial system. To hold the frontiers, Rome had to tax more heavily, and to tax more heavily, it had to risk angering the very citizens whose loyalty it needed. The empire had entered a cycle, in which its wealth bought luxury but also undermined stability. Silk, therefore, was more than cloth. It was a thread that pulled at the seams of empire, unraveling certainties that Romans had long taken for granted. To wear silk was to wear both beauty and burden, to display both triumph and weakness. The empire that conquered lands across 3 continents found itself quietly conquered by a fabric that came from beyond its reach. And in that irony lies a lesson that stretches across centuries. Power is not only measured by armies and laws, but also by who controls the flow of goods that shape desire. If you are still awake, leave a number 1 in the comments. The Roman appetite for silk did not diminish with warnings from philosophers or decrees from emperors. Instead, it grew stronger, weaving itself into the daily fabric of elite life. At banquets in Rome's grand villas, women appeared in gowns so delicate that poets compared them to veils of mist. Senators who prided themselves on the rugged traditions of their ancestors now found themselves competing in displays of extravagance. Juvenal, the satirist, mocked this hunger for foreign finery, writing that Rome had become a city obsessed with appearances, measuring worth not by deeds but by the shine of one's attire. His biting words captured a growing unease. If the Republic had once been built on discipline and sacrifice, what did it mean when its heirs were clothed in garments spun by unseen hands thousands of miles away? The economic consequences were harder to ignore. As gold and silver drained eastward, Rome faced increasing pressure to replenish its reserves. The empire minted coins in vast numbers, but inflation followed as the silver content of denarii was quietly reduced. Historians like Dio Cassius noted the creeping debasement of Roman currency, a policy that temporarily eased shortages but eroded confidence in money itself. What had once been hard coin became alloyed with base metals, a silent admission that the state could not sustain its appetite for spending. Citizens noticed. A denarius that had once bought a basket of grain now bought less, and ordinary families found their livelihoods squeezed. Trade imbalances deepened Rome's reliance on conquest. To keep treasuries full, emperors turned to war, seeking plunder, to balance the drain of trade. Campaigns in Dacia, under Trajan, for example, yielded immense spoils of gold, celebrated in triumphal arches and monuments. But conquest was a temporary fix, a burst of wealth that vanished once spent. The hunger for silk, spices, and other luxuries remained, and the cycle resumed. Rome was chasing its own tail, fighting wars to pay for fabrics that only increased demand for more wars. It was a treadmill of glory and exhaustion, and step by step, the empire wore itself thin. Ordinary citizens rarely saw silk with their own eyes, but they lived with its consequences. Heavy taxes funded imperial campaigns and subsidized the luxuries of the elite. Farmers struggled under levies that left little for themselves. Urban poor relied increasingly on the grain dole, the annona, which the state maintained to prevent unrest. Bread and circuses kept discontent manageable, but they also masked deeper economic fractures. Beneath the glitter of Rome's amphitheaters and triumphal parades lay a system stretched to its limits, its foundations undermined by invisible currents of trade. The parallels to America in 2025 are striking. The United States, too, has faced decades of trade deficits, financing a lifestyle dependent on imports while industries at home withered. Factories that once anchored communities in the Rust Belt now stand silent, their workers displaced. At the same time, debt has mounted, with federal deficits climbing year after year. Policymakers debate how long this can continue, whether the flow of wealth outward is sustainable, or whether it hollows the nation's strength. Rome's experience whispers an answer. No empire, however mighty, can bleed treasure indefinitely, without consequence. And yet, even as Rome strained, the allure of silk remained irresistible. The very debates over morality and economics only heightened its mystique. To forbid something is to make it more desirable, and silk was no exception. Laws were passed, such as those under Emperor Tiberius, attempting to limit who could wear the fabric. These efforts failed almost immediately. In Rome's culture of status, to be denied silk was to be marked as inferior, and no law could extinguish that hunger. The empire's elite would rather risk ruin than give up the cloth that symbolized their supremacy. The irony was bitter. Rome's legions could crush rebellions. Its engineers could build aqueducts that carried water for miles. Its administrators could govern provinces spanning continents. Yet in the matter of silk, Rome was powerless. It could not produce it, it could not control its supply, and it could not curb its people's desire. A civilization that claimed dominion over the world was quietly at the mercy of a fabric. In that irony lies a profound truth about power. It is not always lost in battlefields. Sometimes it seeps away in markets, in luxuries, in the slow drip of wealth that flows outward and never returns. By the 2nd century, silk was no longer just a novelty. It was embedded in the empire's culture. It lined the coffins of the wealthy, wrapped statues of gods, and adorned the robes of emperors. What had begun as a curiosity had become necessity, at least for those who defined themselves by status. And like any necessity, it came with a price that the empire itself would continue to pay. If you are still awake, leave a number 1 in the comments. As silk became embedded in Roman society, the empire discovered that desire is the most difficult enemy to defeat. Legions could fight Parthian horsemen on distant plains, but they could not conquer the hunger of their own citizens for luxury. Attempts to regulate consumption through laws were repeatedly undermined, not only by the elite who ignored them, but by the very emperors who issued them. Tiberius, who once railed against the moral corruption of silk, is said to have worn garments interwoven with the fabric. The hypocrisy was plain for all to see, and it revealed a deeper truth. Rome had become entangled in a cycle of demand that no decree could unwind. The problem was more than moral outrage. Economists today might call it a structural imbalance. The empire was exporting little of equal value in return. Roman glass, wines, and olive oil reached markets in the east, but none could match the worth of silk. Thus the flow of wealth was one way, a steady current of gold and silver vanishing into the hands of merchants who carried it eastward through Persia and Central Asia. Rome was not merely trading, it was transferring power. For in every age, wealth is power, and the loss of one gradually erodes the other. The middlemen who controlled this trade understood their advantage well. Parthian and later Sassanid rulers taxed caravans heavily, growing rich off goods that never originated in their lands. Rome's frustration with this economic chokehold turned into military ventures, but victory proved elusive. The disastrous defeat of Crassus at Carrhae remained a scar on Roman pride, and later campaigns under emperors such as Trajan or Marcus Aurelius yielded little lasting control of the roots. The empire that prided itself on subduing the known world was forced to tolerate dependence on rivals it despised. For ordinary Romans, the consequences unfolded slowly but steadily. Inflation crept into daily life as the silver content of coins declined. By the 3rd century, denarii were so debased that trust in them collapsed, and trade in some regions reverted to barter. Archaeological finds show hordes of older, purer coins buried in the ground, perhaps hidden by families who feared their savings would lose value. Each coin of diminished worth was a reminder that the empire was consuming beyond its means, and silk was a constant symbol of that excess. While senators and equestrians paraded in shimmering robes, the urban poor lined up for grain doles, and soldiers grumbled about late or insufficient pay. This discontent was not only economic but social. The widening gulf between rich and poor eroded the solidarity that had once bound the empire. Rome had been built on the idea that citizens shared in its prosperity, that conquest enriched the whole. But as wealth drained eastward, it concentrated in fewer hands, leaving many feeling excluded from the promise of empire. Satirists like Juvenal mocked the spectacle of elites drowning in luxury while commoners survived on bread and circus games. Beneath the laughter was bitterness, the kind that corrodes trust in institutions and leaders. The pattern is not alien to our own time. In America of 2025, debates over inequality echo these Roman dilemmas. Just as gold drained eastward in Rome, dollars flow outward in trade deficits that now measure in the trillions. Technology and consumer goods arrive in abundance, yet the benefits are unevenly distributed. Cities flourish while rural towns decline. The very system that promises prosperity to all seems instead to enrich the few while burdening the many. And, like Rome, America finds itself dependent on rivals, uneasy about the leverage that comes from relying on supply chains controlled by others. The questions raised in the Senate of ancient Rome about silk are not so different from those raised in Congress today about semiconductors, rare earths, or oil. Even the military dimension bears a parallel. Rome sought to assert itself by force, but its campaigns drained resources without solving the fundamental problem of dependency. In the same way, America projects naval power to secure shipping lanes, yet the vulnerabilities of global trade remain. Rome learned too late that not all threats can be met with legions. Some battles are fought in markets, in ledgers, and in the quiet erosion of confidence. By the late empire, silk had ceased to be a novelty. It was common among the wealthy, woven into the very fabric of daily life. Statues of gods were draped in it, emperors were crowned in it, and the dead were buried in it. What began as curiosity had become necessity, and necessity is the hardest addiction to break. Rome's economy adapted, but never recovered from the imbalance. The empire endured for centuries, yet beneath its grandeur lay a slow bleed that no conquest could fully stop. In this, silk was more than fabric, it was a mirror. It reflected the desires and weaknesses of Rome, showing an empire mighty in arms, yet vulnerable in appetite, and it reminds us that no civilization, however powerful, is immune to the quiet power of trade and the dangers of losing balance between what it takes and what it gives. If you are still awake, leave a number 1 in the comments. By the time Rome entered its later centuries, silk was no longer a scandalous novelty but an entrenched symbol of status and power. The shimmering cloth adorned senators, generals, and emperors alike, woven not only into clothing but into the rituals of the state. It wrapped statues of gods, lined the coffins of the wealthy, and filled the wardrobes of the imperial family. Silk had become Rome's badge of sophistication, its marker of civilization. Yet behind the glitter, the drain of wealth continued unabated, pulling at the very sinews of the empire. Historians such as Ammianus, Marcellinus, described a society increasingly obsessed with luxury, where elites measured themselves by their adornments rather than their service. The warnings of Pliny, Seneca, and Juvenal seemed prophetic. Rome had allowed itself to be conquered, not by armies, but by desire. The coins that once funded legions were now diverted to merchants who carried them across deserts and seas. When emperors sought to restore order by debasing currency further, confidence eroded. By the 3rd century, inflation surged, and the empire teetered on financial crises. Soldiers demanded higher pay to match rising costs, and when the treasury faltered, loyalty wavered. Armies proclaimed new emperors with alarming frequency, plunging the empire into civil wars that weakened its borders and invited invasions. Silk, of course, was not the sole cause of Rome's troubles. Yet it became the most visible symbol of imbalance, the shimmering fabric that told a story of wealth flowing outward and weakness growing inward. The empire that had conquered Gaul, Egypt, and Judea could not conquer its own appetite. It fought wars to control trade routes, spent fortunes to subsidize luxury, and in doing so strained the very foundations of its strength. By the late empire, even as Christianity rose and emperors sought to reframe Rome's identity, silk remained at the heart of its image. Bishops wore it in ceremonies, imperial courts displayed it with pride, and the people could not imagine their world without it. Dependency had become tradition, and tradition had become necessity. The costs, however, were undeniable. The widening gap between rich and poor fractured the unity of society. While elites wrapped themselves in silk, the common people endured poverty and insecurity. Grain doles kept them fed, but not content. Discontent festered, erupting in riots and rebellions that revealed the fragility of Rome's social order. Each shimmering robe was, in a sense, a reminder of inequality, of wealth drained away from the many to serve the vanity of the few. It was not the fabric itself that weakened Rome, but the imbalance it symbolized, the choices of rulers who valued appearance over stability. The echoes reach us still. In America of 2025, the debates about deficits, imports, and inequality sound hauntingly familiar. Just as Rome poured gold eastward for silk, the United States pours dollars abroad for goods it no longer produces at home. Critics warn that this dependency weakens the nation, hollowing out industries and concentrating wealth in the hands of elites. Shiny devices, luxury imports, and global supply chains mask the vulnerabilities beneath. Like Rome, America risks mistaking abundance for strength, forgetting that prosperity is only as secure as the system that sustains it. And like Rome, America faces the question of whether its wealth is flowing outward faster than its strength can replenish. Yet history is not destiny. Rome's story is a warning, not a prophecy. The drain of gold did not end the empire overnight, but it was part of a slow erosion, a weakening that left Rome vulnerable when true crises struck. For us today, the lesson is clear. The balance between desire and discipline, between imports and self-sufficiency, matters as much as armies or laws. The fabrics we choose, the luxuries we crave, can shape the fate of nations as surely as battles. on distant fields. Silk, in the end, was more than cloth. It was a thread woven through the story of Rome's decline, a reminder that empires can be undone, not only by enemies outside their walls, but by the appetites within. Rome wore its wealth proudly, but in doing so, it also wore the marks of its fragility. The empire glittered, but the glitter concealed cracks, spreading quietly beneath. As we close this chapter of the Silk Road, we see Rome not only as conqueror but as consumer, a giant brought to heel by its own desires. The shimmering robes of its senators and emperors still gleam in memory, but they gleam also as warnings. For America in 2025, the question remains: can a great power indulge its desires without draining its strength? Or must it, like Rome, learn, too late, that every luxury carries a cost? If you are still awake, leave a number 1 in the comments. The Silk Road was never only about goods. The caravans that trudged across the deserts carried more than silk, spices, and precious stones. Tucked inside the baggage of merchants, written on fragile scrolls, spoken in hymns and chants, traveled the beliefs of entire civilizations, ideas, once born in quiet monasteries or bustling city temples, spread along the same routes as jade and gold. Faith became one of the most enduring exports of the Silk Road, shaping the destinies of empires far more profoundly than luxury cloth ever could. One of the earliest and most powerful of these currents was Buddhism. Emerging in India around the 5th century before Christ, it began as the teaching of a prince who abandoned his palace to seek an end to suffering. The words of Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, spoke of compassion, discipline, and release from the cycle of desire. For centuries, his teachings remained rooted in the subcontinent, spreading through monasteries and royal patronage. Yet by the first centuries of the Common Era, Buddhism found new pathways. Merchants from India traveled northward into Central Asia, carrying not only spices and textiles, but also their faith. At way stations on the edges of the Taklamakan Desert, they built small shrines where weary travelers could find shelter. These shrines grew into monasteries, and the monasteries became hubs of cultural exchange. The caves at Dunhuang, carved into the rock along the Gansu corridor, still bear witness to this migration of faith. Their walls are covered in vibrant murals, painted with scenes of the Buddha's life and the celestial beings of his teachings. Archaeologists uncovering these sites have found manuscripts in multiple languages: Sanskrit, Chinese, Tibetan, evidence of the Silk Road's role as a great translator of worlds. A monk could travel from India to China, carrying his sutras, and along the way he would meet interpreters, scholars, and fellow seekers who ensured that the message of Buddhism survived the journey. In this way, what began as the insight of one man in northern India became a faith that shaped Chinese art, politics, and philosophy for centuries. But faith did not travel without risk. Just as silk caravans faced sandstorms and bandits, missionaries and monks confronted dangers of their own. They were vulnerable not only to the elements, but also to suspicion. Local rulers, wary of foreign influence, sometimes persecuted believers. Others embraced them, hoping to draw spiritual legitimacy from new teachings. The story of Kumarayeva, a monk born in Central Asia in the 4th century, captures both the peril and promise of this exchange. Captured in war and taken to China, he became one of the most important translators of Buddhist texts, his work shaping how millions understood the faith. His life was marked by hardship, yet his legacy endured across centuries. Faith, it seemed, could not be silenced even by conquest. The spread of religion along the Silk Road transformed societies in ways more enduring than trade. A bolt of silk could be worn and destroyed, but an idea could remake a culture. The Chinese court wrestled with Buddhism's challenge to Confucian orthodoxy. Central Asian kingdoms adopted new rituals and philosophies. Over time, Islam too would travel these roads, carried by merchants as much as warriors, spreading from Arabia into Persia, Central Asia, and beyond. Even Christianity, in its Nestorian form, planted small but significant communities in China, leaving crosses carved into stones that still stand today. This exchange of belief came with both light and shadow. Faith brought solace, unity, and inspiration. It gave meaning to merchants crossing hostile deserts and to rulers seeking legitimacy in the eyes of their people. But it also brought conflict, as new religions competed with old, and suspicion turned to persecution. Just as trade could enrich one empire while bankrupting another, faith could uplift communities even as it fractured them. In this, there is a lesson for our own time. America in 2025 is not carried by caravans, but it too is a crossroad of belief. Ideas travel faster than ever, across digital highways rather than desert tracks. Faiths intermingle, philosophies clash, and new movements rise in unexpected places. The same tensions that haunted the Silk Road remain. Openness brings vitality, but it also brings friction. Just as the monks of Dunhuang carved their prayers into stone to preserve them against time, so too do modern communities seek to preserve identity in a world of constant exchange. The Silk Road reminds us that goods may build wealth, but ideas build civilizations. The faiths that crossed deserts and mountains carried no weight in caravans, yet they reshaped the world more deeply than silk ever did. They show us that the greatest treasures of the road were not bolts of cloth, but the beliefs that endured. When the cloth had long since turned to dust, if you are still awake, leave a number 1 in the comments. As Buddhism carved its place along the Silk Road, it was joined by other faiths that traveled with equal determination. Religion, unlike silk or spices, asked not for coins but for conviction. Yet conviction could be even more powerful than gold, for it bound communities together and often outlasted dynasties. The road, stretching from the Mediterranean to the Pacific, became a great tapestry of belief where doctrines intertwined, sometimes harmoniously, sometimes with bitter conflict. One of the most striking examples was the rise of Nestorian Christianity in the East. After the Council of Ephesus, in 431, condemned Nestorius for his teachings about the nature of Christ. His followers fled persecution in the Roman world. They found refuge along the trade routes, moving eastward through Persia and into Central Asia. By the 7th century, Nestorian bishops were present in China itself. The famous Nestorian stele, erected in 781 in Xi'an, tells the story in Chinese characters of a faith born in the Roman world, but adapted to the rhythms of Chinese society. It describes monks arriving in the Tang capital, welcomed by the emperor, and founding monasteries where Christian prayers mingled with Buddhist chants and Taoist rituals. This was not simply the spread of a doctrine, it was the transformation of identity. Proof that religions could cross mountains and deserts as readily as caravans of silk. Islam too became a child of the road. Emerging in Arabia in the 7th century, it expanded rapidly through conquest, but it also spread quietly through merchants. Muslim traders from Persia and Central Asia carried not only textiles and spices, but also the Quran. They built mosques in oasis towns, where the call to prayer rang out alongside the noise of markets. The faith's adaptability allowed it to root itself in diverse cultures, linking believers from Samarkand to Kashgar. In time, Islam would become one of the dominant forces shaping the Silk Road, offering not just spiritual guidance, but also systems of law and trade ethics that smoothed transactions between strangers. But with faith came rivalry. When religions crossed paths, they often collided. Kingdoms that had once worshipped local gods now found themselves hosts to Buddhist monks, Christian priests, and Muslim scholars, each preaching truths that could not easily be reconciled. At times, rulers tried to balance these influences, granting tolerance in hopes of reaping the benefits of trade and knowledge. At other times, suspicion turned to persecution. Monasteries were burned, churches destroyed, mosques attacked. The Silk Road was not only a highway of belief, but also a battleground of the spirit, where unity could turn into division overnight. The most devastating travelers, however, were not prophets, but plagues. Faith and disease shared the same roots, moving invisibly with caravans. In the 6th century, the plague of Justinian swept from Central Asia into Byzantium, carried by fleas on rodents hidden in grain shipments. It killed perhaps a third of the Eastern Roman Empire's population, shattering its strength and weakening its ability to resist invaders. Centuries later, the Black Death retraced similar paths, moving along trade routes from Asia into Europe, killing tens of millions. In both cases, the very networks that carried sacred texts and hopeful converts also carried unseen doom. Faith promised salvation, but disease delivered despair. For the people who lived along the Silk Road, this duality was unavoidable. To open yourself to the world meant to receive its gifts and its curses alike. Monks might arrive with wisdom, but ships might arrive with sickness. A family in Aleppo or Samarkand could find itself blessed with new crops or devastated by sudden pestilence. There was no way to separate the light from the shadow, no way to accept one without risking the other. This truth resonates with us today. America in 2025 is not connected by camel caravans, but by cargo planes and fiber optic cables. Ideas, faiths, and movements cross borders instantly, shaping politics, culture, and daily life. A sermon uploaded in one country can inspire believers thousands of miles away within seconds. But the same networks carry disinformation, division, and even viruses, both digital and biological. The COVID-19 pandemic reminded us how interconnected we are, how the very system that brings convenience also brings vulnerability, just as the Silk Road bound empires to one another in ways they could not control. So too does globalization bind America to forces far beyond its borders. The Silk Road story of faith teaches us that belief is both treasure and test. It unites, inspires, and transforms, but it also divides, disrupts, and exposes fragility. The monks of Dunhuang, the Nestorian priests in Xi'an, the Muslim traders in Samarkand, all carried with them truths that changed civilizations. Yet they also revealed how fragile civilizations can be when confronted with the unexpected. And so, as we look back, we see that the Silk Road was not only a marketplace, but a mirror of the human spirit, reflecting both our yearning for meaning and our vulnerability to the unknown. If you are still awake, leave a number 1 in the comments. When religions traveled the Silk Road, they did not move in isolation. They encountered one another, exchanged rituals, borrowed symbols, and sometimes clashed in bitter rivalry. The road itself was a crucible, melting traditions together into forms no one had intended. In oasis towns along the Taklamakan, a Buddhist monk might sit in quiet conversation with a Christian priest, while a Muslim merchant listened nearby. Their words could mingle, their practices could blend, and over time, hybrid cultures were born. This blending is visible even now in the art of Central Asia, where frescoes depict Buddhist imagery painted with Persian styles, and where crosses appear alongside lotus flowers. The Silk Road, in this sense, was not simply a highway of belief, but a workshop of spiritual invention. One striking example lies in the kingdom of Khotan, an oasis city on the southern edge of the desert. Archaeological finds there reveal Buddhist texts written in multiple languages, proof of a community where merchants and monks from many lands shared a fragile peace. Khotan's rulers patronized Buddhism, yet they also welcomed traders of other faiths, understanding that tolerance was good for business. Wealth and piety walked hand in hand, a reminder that spiritual diversity was often less about philosophy than about survival. but tolerance could be fleeting. When political winds shifted or enemies threatened, the welcome mat was withdrawn, and persecution followed. The fragility of this balance made faith both precious and precarious on the Silk Road. The story of Zhuangzang, a Chinese monk of the Tang dynasty, captures both the promise and peril of this spiritual journey. In the 7th century, dissatisfied with incomplete translations of Buddhist scriptures, Zhuangzang set out from Chang'an on a pilgrimage to India. His journey took him across deserts, mountains, and countless dangers. He endured bandits, hunger, and storms, driven only by the conviction that truth was worth suffering for. When he returned to China, after more than a decade, he carried hundreds of manuscripts and a wealth of knowledge that reshaped Chinese Buddhism. His determination shows how the Silk Road was not only a channel for trade, but also a path for seekers who risked everything in pursuit of understanding. Yet for every Zhuangzang who succeeded, countless others vanished. Pilgrims died in sandstorms, caravans fell to raiders, manuscripts were lost in floods, and knowledge perished before it could be shared. Faith was carried on fragile scrolls, in the memories of travelers, and in the frail structures of monasteries, vulnerable to fire and war. The survival of religion along the Silk Road was never guaranteed. Its endurance is a testament to human resilience, to the stubborn refusal to let meaning slip away even when circumstances seemed overwhelming. This dual nature of fragility and persistence mirrors the way ideas travel today. In America of 2025, faith and ideology race across digital networks. Sermons, political manifestos, philosophical essays, and conspiracy theories all cross borders in seconds. Some enrich, others divide, many are lost in the noise. Just as Zhuangzang's determination preserved truths that might otherwise have vanished, so too do communities today struggle to safeguard their beliefs in a torrent of information that threatens to drown clarity in confusion. The question remains the same: how do we preserve what matters most in an age of ceaseless exchange? The cultural consequences of faiths spread along the Silk Road were profound. Buddhism reshaped Chinese art, inspiring statues that combined Indian grace with Chinese serenity. Nestorian Christianity introduced new rituals and concepts of morality that left faint but lasting marks on Chinese literature. Islam brought not only theology, but also science, mathematics, and medicine, enriching civilizations that embraced it. In each case, religion was more than a set of doctrines. It was a vessel for entire ways of life. And once those vessels poured their contents into new lands, those lands were never the same. But these transformations were not without conflict. Tensions between old and new beliefs often erupted into violence. In the Tang dynasty, Buddhist monasteries grew so wealthy that they threatened the state's authority, leading to waves of persecution. In Central Asia, rival rulers sometimes turned faith into a weapon, suppressing one religion to assert dominance through another. Faith that had promised unity became instead a source of division, proof that ideas, like goods, could be tools of power as much as of salvation. The Silk Road thus reveals a truth that still resonates today. Belief is not static. It moves, it adapts, it transforms, and it can both heal and harm. The monks, merchants, and pilgrims who carried their convictions across deserts may not have intended to reshape the world, but they did. And in their footsteps, we can see our own reflection. For America in 2025, the highways of faith are digital rather than physical, but the dynamics remain. Ideas collide, communities form, tensions rise, and societies are reshaped. The question that haunted Khotan, Dunhuang, and Chang'an still haunts us. Can diversity of belief be a source of strength, or will it fracture us when pressures mount? If you are still awake, leave a number 1 in the comments. The story of faith along the Silk Road was not only about the triumph of ideas, but also about their vulnerability. Great religions flourished, yet just as often they faltered, buffeted by politics, greed, and fear. What began as a promise of unity could dissolve into suspicion. In some kingdoms, rulers embraced foreign faiths eagerly, hoping to harness their prestige. In others, tolerance gave way to persecution, as elites feared losing their grip on power. The Silk Road was a spiritual highway, but it was also a stage on which the drama of human ambition played out in full. Take, for example, the Tang dynasty in China. During its golden age, Temp's emperors welcomed Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam into their cosmopolitan capital of Chang'an. The city was alive with temples, mosques, and monasteries, each one humming with the prayers of travelers from distant lands. But prosperity bred anxiety. As Buddhist monasteries accumulated wealth, owning land, and collecting donations, they began to rival the state itself. In the 9th century, Emperor Wuzong launched a persecution, closing thousands of monasteries, and forcing monks back into secular life. The rhetoric was framed in terms of protecting tradition, but at its core lay economics and control. A religion that had arrived as a humble foreign guest had grown powerful enough to threaten the throne, and the throne struck back. The same cycle appeared elsewhere. In Persia, Zoroastrianism once stood unchallenged, but with the arrival of Islam, it gradually gave way, its temples fading into ruins. In Central Asia, small Christian communities thrived for centuries, only to vanish under pressure from stronger faiths. Archaeologists have found gravestones etched with crosses in lands that are now overwhelmingly Muslim. Silent testimony to faiths that bloomed briefly and were extinguished. On the Silk Road, survival was never guaranteed. Belief had to adapt, or perish. What made this fragility so poignant was that faith was deeply personal. For the merchant carrying a small amulet of the Buddha across the desert, or the priest whispering prayers in a candlelit chapel, religion was not an abstract system, but a lifeline. It gave meaning to journeys that might end in death, comfort to families separated for years, and hope to communities vulnerable to famine and war. Yet these lifelines could be severed at the stroke of a ruler's pen. Whole communities saw their sacred spaces destroyed, their scrolls burned, their traditions outlawed. For them, the Silk Road was not a story of inspiration, but of heartbreak. And still, belief endured. Even when monasteries were closed, some monks preserved texts in hidden caves, like those at Dunhuang, where manuscripts lay untouched for centuries until rediscovered in the early 20th century. Even when rulers persecuted, small groups of believers carried their traditions in secret, waiting for gentler times. The resilience of faith along the Silk Road is perhaps its most remarkable feature. Fragile in the moment, yet astonishingly durable across centuries. For us today, this paradox feels familiar. America in 2025 is not ruled by emperors, but it too struggles with questions of belief, tolerance, and control. Religious diversity is both a strength and a source of tension. Communities of faith flourish, sometimes clashing with political power, sometimes coexisting uneasily. The digital age has made this even more visible, with sermons, debates, and conflicts spreading instantly across the internet. Just as Chang'an was once a hub where Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam coexisted in uneasy harmony, so too are America's cities' crossroads where multiple faiths meet. The question is whether tolerance can be sustained when economic and political pressures grow. The Silk Road reminds us that diversity of belief can enrich civilizations, but only if managed with wisdom. Without it, suspicion turns to persecution, and communities fracture. The fate of monasteries under Wuzong, of churches buried under desert sands, of Zoroastrian temples reduced to ruins, warn us how quickly tolerance can vanish. For modern America, the lesson is clear. Faith must be protected not only by law, but by culture, by a recognition that belief, in its many forms, is part of the strength of society. The faiths that traveled the Silk Road carried more than doctrines. They carried the resilience of the human spirit. They remind us that even when temples fall and scriptures burn, the longing for meaning does not die. It adapts, survives, and waits for the chance to rise again. If you are still awake, leave a number 1 in the comments. The enduring legacy of faith along the Silk Road was not measured in bolts of silk or coins of gold, but in the resilience of belief itself. Goods enriched markets for a season, but ideas reshaped civilizations for centuries. From India to China, from Arabia to Byzantium, every empire that touched the road felt its spiritual currents. And yet, for all the grandeur of temples and monasteries, faith's path was fragile, carried not by armies, but by individuals, often poor and powerless, who risked their lives so that words might outlast them. Consider the monks of Dunhuang, who painstakingly copied sutras onto scrolls by lamplight. They worked in silence, aware that the sands outside their cave could swallow a caravan without a trace. And yet they trusted that their words might travel further than any camel caravan could. Many of those manuscripts were hidden away during times of persecution, sealed behind walls, only to be rediscovered in 1900 by a Taoist monk named Wang Yuanlu. When scholars finally read them, they found voices preserved for more than 1,000 years before, prayers that had crossed empires and survived collapse. That survival is the essence of faith on the Silk Road. Fragile in the moment, yet indestructible across time. The same is true of Nestorian Christianity. Though its presence in China eventually vanished, its memory lives in the Nestorian stele of 781, standing silent in Xi'an. Carved in stone, its inscriptions tell of priests who traveled thousands of miles, braving deserts in suspicion to bring their gospel to a distant empire. Today, few in China remember their presence, yet the monument endures, a reminder that even small communities can leave a mark that outlasts centuries. Likewise, the early mosques of Central Asia, built by traders who paused between journeys, became seeds of a faith that would spread far beyond their modest beginnings. Faith traveled lightly, but it carried immense weight. Yet it was not only sacred words that crossed the road. It was also sacred tensions. Empires often sought to harness faith for legitimacy. A Temp's emperor might patronize Buddhism to display wisdom, or welcome Islam to strengthen trade ties. But when faith grew too strong, rulers struck back, fearful of losing control. These cycles of welcome and repression left scars on communities. Scars that remind us how precarious tolerance can be. The very networks that carried wisdom could also carry fear. And the road was littered with ruins of temples and shrines destroyed when suspicion triumphed over openness. For the people who lived through these shifts, faith was not an abstraction. It was a source of strength in hardship, of identity in exile, of meaning in a world where caravans disappeared into storms and rulers changed overnight. A merchant whispering prayers at dawn before setting out across the desert was not thinking of empire or theology. He was thinking of survival, of loved ones far away, of the hope that something greater than himself guided the road ahead. Faith gave courage where none seemed possible, and that courage sustained not just individuals, but entire cultures. In many ways, this is the deepest lesson for America in 2025. We live not in desert caravans, but in digital highways. Yet the dynamic is familiar. Ideas race across networks, some uplifting, others destructive. Faiths and philosophies cross borders instantly, colliding and mingling in unpredictable ways. Communities feel both enriched and threatened, just as they did in Chang'an or Samarkand more than 1,000 years ago. and just as emperors once tried to regulate monasteries or restrict religions, modern governments wrestle with how to manage the flow of belief in a world where information cannot be contained. The same questions return. Can diversity of faith and ideology be a source of strength, or will it fracture us when tested by crisis? The Silk Road's spiritual history suggests that resilience lies not in suppressing belief, but in allowing it to adapt and endure. Buddhism did not remain Indian. It became Chinese, Korean, Japanese. Christianity did not remain Roman. It found new forms in Persia and Asia. Islam, too, shaped itself to local traditions as it spread. Faith is strongest when it is flexible, when it can meet new cultures without breaking. America today, with its mosaic of religions and philosophies, faces the same test. The challenge is not to keep faiths apart, but to find a way for them to coexist without losing their essence. In the end, the Silk Road's greatest gift was not silk or spices, but the reminder that humans have always sought meaning beyond survival. The merchants, monks, and pilgrims who carried their beliefs across mountains and deserts knew that goods fade, but ideas endure. They remind us that even when temples fall and scrolls turn to dust, the longing for transcendence remains. It is this longing that binds us across centuries, from the oases of Central Asia to the cities of modern America. Faith on the Silk Road was fragile, yet its echoes still reach us. They whisper that belief can outlast empire, that conviction can survive ruin, and that in the quiet persistence of the human spirit lies the greatest power of all. If you are still awake, leave a number 1 in the comments. By the 13th century, the Silk Road had already witnessed centuries of exchange, conflict, and fragile alliances. Caravans carried silk, gold, and ideas across continents, but the journey was always perilous, shadowed by bandits, unstable kingdoms, and the endless dangers of desert and steppe. Then came a storm from the east, one that terrified rulers, and yet, paradoxically, brought a fleeting age of stability to the road. This storm was the Mongol Empire, born from the vision and violence of Genghis Khan Temujin. The man who would become Genghis Khan began as an outcast on the harsh Mongolian steppe. By sheer will, ruthless discipline, and unmatched charisma, he united the warring clans of the steppe into one force. His horsemen moved faster than any army the world had known, striking fear from China to Persia. Cities that resisted were razed, populations slaughtered or enslaved, and kingdoms that had once seemed untouchable crumbled in weeks. Yet from this destruction emerged an empire unlike any before it, stretching from the shores of the Pacific to the banks of the Danube. For the first and only time in history, nearly the entire length of the Silk Road lay under the control of a single power. This new order became known as the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace. It was a paradox. An empire forged in blood created conditions for commerce to flourish. With bandits crushed, rival kingdoms subdued, and roads secured by Mongol patrols, merchants could travel from Venice to Beijing with an ease unimaginable in earlier centuries. Marco Polo, the Venetian traveler whose name still echoes in our imaginations, owed his famous journey to this stability. Without the Mongols, it is doubtful a European merchant could have reached the court of Kublai Khan and returned alive to tell the tale. For a brief century, the world felt smaller, as if the threads of the Silk Road had been tightened by the iron grip of Mongol power. But stability under the Mongols was never gentle. Their rule depended on fear as much as law. Cities that submitted were spared, often allowed to keep their rulers and traditions, but those who resisted were annihilated. The message was clear. Obedience bought safety. Rebellion guaranteed death. Merchants thrived under this system, but civilians often paid with their freedom. Taxes were heavy, and local populations groaned under the weight of supporting the empire's endless campaigns. For the Mongols, Commerce was not merely tolerated but actively encouraged, for it filled their coffers and supplied their armies. The Silk Road became a financial artery of empire, pumping wealth into Mongol hands even as it enriched others. The paradox of the Pax Mongolica offers a lesson still relevant in America in 2025. Stability in global trade often depends on power that is neither invisible nor benign. The United States Navy, patrolling sea lanes from the Strait of Hormuz to the South China Sea, provides a modern echo of the Mongol horsemen who once secured the deserts. Like the Mongols, America guarantees the safety of commerce, but also bears the costs of maintaining that dominance. Critics argue that this system is unsustainable, that it burdens taxpayers while enriching corporations. Yet without it, supply chains falter, markets panic, and instability spreads. The question is the same as it was 8 centuries ago. How long can one power bear the burden of securing the world's wealth before the cost becomes too heavy? The Mongols themselves discovered that such peace is always temporary. Though caravans moved more freely, and cultures mingled with new intensity, the empire's vastness contained seeds of division. Different khanates emerged after Genghis Khan's death, each loyal more to its local ambitions than to a universal order. Still, in the early decades of Mongol supremacy, the Silk Road thrived as never before. Knowledge traveled with the same speed as goods. Papermaking techniques spread westward, while medical texts and astronomical knowledge flowed east. It was as if the world had been rewired by the hoofbeats of Mongol horses. And yet, beneath the prosperity, unease remained. People whispered of destruction still fresh in memory, of cities like Nishapur and Baghdad reduced to ash. The merchants who praised Mongol safety knew that it had been bought with massacres. The road was safe, but only because terror had paved. Its safety and suffering coexisted uneasily. A contradiction that makes the Pax Mongolica one of history's most complex chapters. If you are still awake, leave a number 1 in the comments. The Pax Mongolica, though brief in the span of centuries, created a transformation along the Silk Road that contemporaries could scarcely comprehend. For the first time, merchants could journey from one end of Eurasia to the other under the authority of a single empire. This was not a minor achievement. In earlier centuries, the road was fragmented, broken into sections controlled by kingdoms and tribes that taxed, robbed, or fought one another. Now, under the Mongols, those obstacles dissolved. The empire issued passports paisi, small plaques, of metal that bore the Khan's seal granting their holders safe passage across thousands of miles. To possess one was to carry a shield stronger than any sword. For to harm a traveler bearing the Khan's token was to invite swift retribution. From his horseman Marco Polo, whose travels have captivated readers for centuries, is perhaps the most famous beneficiary of this order. Setting out from Venice in the late 13th century with his father and uncle, he reached the court of Kublai Khan in China, where he remained for nearly 2 decades. His tales, later recorded in Il Million, dazzled Europeans with descriptions of vast cities, paper money, and efficient postal systems. While scholars debate the accuracy of some details, there is no doubt that his journey would have been impossible without Mongol rule. His story embodies the paradox of the Pax Mongolica, a world made smaller by conquest, where even distant lands felt suddenly accessible. Yet the benefits came wrapped in blood. The same empire that secured caravans also left behind cities reduced to ash. Baghdad, once the jewel of the Islamic world, fell to the Mongols in 1258. Its libraries, filled with centuries of knowledge, were destroyed, and its population slaughtered in numbers so vast that chroniclers described the Tigris River running black with ink and red with blood. The tragedy of Baghdad reveals the dual nature of Mongol order, where submission was absent, destruction followed. And yet, once the terror had passed, trade routes reopened, and goods flowed once more. For merchants, survival of the route mattered more than survival of cities. Prosperity was built on devastation, a contradiction as old as empire itself. Merchants and scholars alike recognized the unusual security of this period. Caravanserais roadside inns flourished, spaced at intervals across the empire to provide food, shelter, and safety. Postal relays enabled messages to travel with astonishing speed, carried by fresh horses waiting at each station. A letter could cross the empire in weeks, not months. Knowledge spread with new intensity. Chinese gunpowder technology reached the Middle East and Europe, reshaping warfare forever. In return, Persian astronomy and medicine enriched Chinese scholarship. The Silk Road, under Mongol rule, became less a series of fragile connections and more a genuine system of exchange for ordinary people. However, the picture was more complex. While merchants profited, farmers bore heavy taxes to fund Mongol campaigns. Local populations were often displaced or conscripted into labor. The empire's appetite for tributes strained communities, and resentment simmered beneath the surface. The promise of safety for caravans often meant hardship for those whose lives financed that safety. In this, the Pax Mongolica reveals the old truth that empires rarely distribute their benefits evenly. The lesson resonates today. America in 2025, like the Mongols of the 13th century, guarantees global commerce through its power. Cargo ships cross oceans under the watchful presence of the U.S. Navy. Airlines fly safely across skies, monitored by international agreements brokered largely by American influence. To harm an American protected shipping lane is to invite consequences, much as harming a Mongol-protected caravan once did. Yet, as with the Mongols, this security comes at a cost. The burden falls not only on government budgets, but also on the ordinary citizens who pay taxes, serve in militaries, and weather the economic consequences of maintaining global order. Critics argue that while corporations reap the profits of global trade, average households face rising debt, stagnant wages, and anxieties about stability. The parallels with the burdens of farmers under Mongol rule are striking, if not identical. Still, the achievements of the Pax Mongolica cannot be denied. For a fleeting century, the Silk Road became the closest thing to a global network the pre-modern world had ever seen. Goods, ideas, technologies, and even diseases traveled with unprecedented speed. It was the beginning of a world that felt smaller, more interconnected, more vulnerable to shocks, both wondrous and terrible. The irony of this chapter is clear. An empire born in conquest gave birth to exchange. Violence created peace, and destruction opened doors. The hoofbeats of Mongol horses carried not only terror, but also connection, weaving together lands that had long been divided. In their wake, the Silk Road reached a peak of vitality it would never see again. If you are still awake, leave a number 1 in the comments. The Mongol Empire was more than a political giant. It was a bridge. Under its rule, the Silk Road connected not only merchants, but also minds. Scholars, engineers, and artisans moved with a freedom rare in earlier centuries. Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis, welcomed foreigners into his court in China. Persians, Arabs, and even Europeans found places of influence in his administration. He valued knowledge as much as tribute, and the diversity of his advisors reflected the breadth of his empire. What emerged was a circulation of ideas that reshaped Eurasia. Paper money, perfected in China, intrigued Europeans who marveled at the concept of value detached from metal. In return, advancements in medicine, mathematics, and astronomy flowed eastward. It was not only silk that traveled these routes, but the very building blocks of intellectual life. Yet this remarkable exchange was born from fear and compulsion. Behind the glittering accounts of Marco Polo lay the darker reality of Mongol rule. Entire populations had been uprooted, forced into resettlement projects designed to harness talent for the empire. Artisans captured in Persia were relocated to China to build cities and workshops. Korean and Chinese shipbuilders were compelled to construct fleets for Mongol invasions of Japan. This movement of people was at once brutal and productive, creating cultural mixtures that might never have occurred voluntarily. For those forced into exile, the Silk Road was not a highway of opportunity, but a chain of bondage. The contradictions were everywhere. Trade flourished, but so did slavery. Knowledge spread, but often because it was seized from conquered lands. Cities bustled with new energy, but they did so on the ashes of others. The Pax Mongolica, like all imperiums, was never as peaceful as its name suggests. It was a peace secured by terror, prosperity balanced on the edge of a sword. Ordinary merchants, however, often looked past these contradictions. For them, the Mongol stamp of protection meant survival. Caravans could now cross territories that had once been death traps. Caravanserais offered safety, and postal relays provided rapid communication. Trade records show an unprecedented movement of goods. Chinese porcelain in Middle Eastern markets, Persian textiles in East Asian courts, and spices flowing steadily into Europe. For the first time, there was a genuine sense that the world could be stitched together, that goods from one corner could reliably reach another. Still, fragility lingered beneath the surface. The same roots that carried silk and spices also carried plague. In the mid-14th century, long after Genghis, but still within the structures the Mongols had forged, the Black Death swept across Eurasia. It likely began in the steppe, traveling with rodents and fleas aboard caravans and ships. Within a few short years, it annihilated a third of Europe's population, devastated China's cities, and brought entire regions to collapse. The very networks that had once promised wealth now delivered death. The Mongols had made the world smaller, but in doing so, they had also made it more vulnerable. This paradox resonates in America of 2025. The United States has built and maintained the arteries of global commerce. From shipping lanes to digital networks, goods move at unprecedented speed, and information travels instantly. Yet these same networks make the country vulnerable to shocks. A virus crossing oceans in days, a cyberattack rippling through financial systems in seconds, or a blockage in a distant strait, sending shockwaves through American markets. Like the Mongols, America has discovered that connectivity is both strength and risk. The question is not whether to be connected, but how to manage the costs of that connection. The cultural effects of Mongol rule also remain a reminder. Multicultural exchange can enrich societies, but it can also breed tension, just as Mongol courts brought together diverse peoples under one banner. America today hosts a vast diversity of voices and cultures. The challenge lies in whether such diversity can be managed with fairness, or whether it will fracture under pressure. The Mongols held it together with fear. Modern democracies must attempt the same with consensus. The difficulty of that task should not be underestimated. In the end, the Pax Mongolica was a fleeting miracle, born of conquest yet remembered for connection. It offered a glimpse of what a unified world might look like. Goods flowing freely, ideas crossing borders, cultures mingling in unexpected ways. But it also revealed the dangers of overreach, the fragility of systems held together by force, and the inevitability of collapse when strains became too great. If you are still awake, leave a number 1 in the comments. The Mongol Empire at its height gave the illusion of permanence, as if its vast reach across deserts and steppes, mountains and seas, could hold forever. From the perspective of a merchant traveling under its banners, the road seemed more secure than it had ever been. The sight of the Paisi, the official Mongol pass granting safe conduct, offered reassurance that one could travel from Samarkand to Beijing without fear of bandits or rogue soldiers. Caravanserais dotted the routes like way stations of civilization amid desolation, providing shelter, food, and guards. For a moment, it appeared that the Silk Road had been transformed into something it had never truly been before, a genuine artery of global trade, running smoothly under a single authority. But beneath the surface of this order, cracks widened. The very scale of the empire that secured the road made it difficult to govern. After the death of Genghis Khan, his heirs divided the realm into khanates: the Yuan in China under Kublai Khan, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Golden Horde in Russia, and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia. At first, these divisions maintained loose cooperation, but over time they drifted apart. Local rulers placed their own ambitions above imperial unity. The arteries of trade remained open, but the heart that pumped their lifeblood no longer beat in harmony. Still, in those early decades, the Pax Mongolica brought cultural and scientific ferment. Persian astronomers shared their knowledge in Chinese courts, while Chinese innovations like gunpowder and printing spread westward. Even cuisine reflected the exchange, as new spices appeared in unexpected kitchens. The empire became a corridor not just of goods, but of ideas that would shape the Renaissance in Europe and the future of Asia alike. The irony is that this flourishing was sustained by a system built on conquest and fear. Behind every innovation lay the memory of cities leveled, populations massacred, and dynasties extinguished. The brilliance of the Mongol network cannot be separated from the brutality that created it. For those who lived under Mongol rule, the contradictions were stark. Merchants praised the safety of the roads, but farmers groaned under taxes that funded endless campaigns. Craftsmen flourished when relocated to serve Mongol needs, but they did so in exile, torn from their homelands. Entire communities carried the scars of forced migrations. The empire was at once a facilitator of exchange and a devourer of lives. This duality offers a sobering reflection for America in 2025. The United States secures global trade routes through its Navy and its influence in international institutions. Its power ensures that cargo ships pass safely through straits and that markets remain connected. Yet this security demands enormous expenditure, trillions of dollars over decades, and the burden falls on taxpayers who may never see direct benefits. Soldiers deploy overseas to guard supply chains whose profits flow to corporations, not always to the households of ordinary Americans. Like the Mongols, America bears both the pride and the cost of maintaining global order. Stability enriches some, but it strains others. Still, the achievements of the Pax Mongolica cannot be denied. For a fleeting century, the Silk Road became the closest thing to a global network the pre-modern world had ever seen. Goods, ideas, technologies, and even diseases traveled with unprecedented speed. It was the beginning of a world that felt smaller, more interconnected, more vulnerable to shocks, both wondrous and terrible. The irony of this chapter is clear. An empire born in conquest gave birth to exchange. Violence created peace, and destruction opened doors. The hoofbeats of Mongol horses carried not only terror, but also connection, weaving together lands that had long been divided. In their wake, the Silk Road reached a peak of vitality it would never see again. If you are still awake, leave a number 1 in the comments. The Mongol Empire was more than a political giant. It was a bridge. Under its rule, the Silk Road connected not only merchants but also minds. Scholars, engineers, and artisans moved with a freedom rare in earlier centuries. Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis, welcomed foreigners into his court in China. Persians, Arabs, and even Europeans found places of influence in his administration. He valued knowledge as much as tribute, and the diversity of his advisors reflected the breadth of his empire. What emerged was a circulation of ideas that reshaped Eurasia. Paper money, perfected in China, intrigued Europeans who marveled at the concept of value detached from metal. In return, advancements in medicine, mathematics, and astronomy flowed eastward. It was not only silk that traveled these routes, but the very building blocks of intellectual life. Yet this remarkable exchange was born from fear and compulsion. Behind the glittering accounts of Marco Polo lay the darker reality of Mongol rule. Entire populations had been uprooted, forced into resettlement projects designed to harness talent for the empire. Artisans captured in Persia were relocated to China to build cities and workshops. Korean and Chinese shipbuilders were compelled to construct fleets for Mongol invasions of Japan. This movement of people was at once brutal and productive, creating cultural mixtures that might never have occurred voluntarily. For those forced into exile, the Silk Road was not a highway of opportunity, but a chain of bondage. The contradictions were everywhere. Trade flourished, but so did slavery. Knowledge spread, but often because it was seized from conquered lands. Cities bustled with new energy, but they did so on the ashes of others. The Pax Mongolica, like all imperiums, was never as peaceful as its name suggests. It was a peace secured by terror, prosperity balanced on the edge of a sword. Ordinary merchants, however, often looked past these contradictions. For them, the Mongol stamp of protection meant survival. Caravans could now cross territories that had once been death traps. Caravanserais offered safety, and postal relays provided rapid communication. Trade records show an unprecedented movement of goods. Chinese porcelain in Middle Eastern markets, Persian textiles in East Asian courts, and spices flowing steadily into Europe. For the first time, there was a genuine sense that the world could be stitched together, that goods from one corner could reliably reach another. Still, fragility lingered beneath the surface. The same routes that carried silk and spices also carried plague. In the mid-14th century, long after Genghis, but still within the structures the Mongols had forged, the Black Death swept across Eurasia. It likely began in the steppe, traveling with rodents and fleas aboard caravans and ships. Within a few short years, it annihilated a third of Europe's population, devastated China's cities, and brought entire regions to collapse. The very networks that had once promised wealth now delivered death. The Mongols had made the world smaller, but in doing so, they had also made it more vulnerable. This paradox resonates in America of 2025. The United States has built and maintained the arteries of global commerce. From shipping lanes to digital networks, goods move at unprecedented speed, and information travels instantly. Yet these same networks make the country vulnerable to shocks. A virus crossing oceans in days, a cyberattack rippling through financial systems in seconds, or a blockage in a distant strait sending shockwaves through American markets. Like the Mongols, America has discovered that connectivity is both strength and risk. The question is not whether to be connected, but how to manage the costs of that connection. The cultural effects of Mongol rule also remain a reminder. Multicultural exchange can enrich societies, but it can also breed tension, just as Mongol courts brought together diverse peoples under one banner. America today hosts a vast diversity of voices and cultures. The challenge lies in whether such diversity can be managed with fairness, or whether it will fracture under pressure. The Mongols held it together with fear. Modern democracies must attempt the same with consensus. The difficulty of that task should not be underestimated. In the end, the Pax Mongolica was a fleeting miracle, born of conquest, yet remembered for connection. It offered a glimpse of what a unified world might look like. Goods flowing freely, ideas crossing borders, cultures mingling in unexpected ways. But it also revealed the dangers of overreach, the fragility of systems held together by force, and the inevitability of collapse when strains became too great. If you are still awake, leave a number 1 in the comments. The Mongol Empire at its height gave the illusion of permanence, as if its vast reach across deserts and steppes, mountains and seas, could hold forever. From the perspective of a merchant traveling under its banners, the road seemed more secure than it had ever been. The sight of the Paisi, the official Mongol pass, granting safe conduct, offered reassurance that one could travel from Samarkand to Beijing without fear of bandits or rogue soldiers. Caravanserais dotted the routes like way stations of civilization amid desolation, providing shelter, food, and guards. For a moment, it appeared that the Silk Road had been transformed into something it had never truly been before. A genuine artery of global trade running smoothly under a single authority. But beneath the surface of this order, cracks widened. The very scale of the empire that secured the road made it difficult to govern. After the death of Genghis Khan, his heirs divided the realm into khanates: the Yuan in China under Kublai Khan, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Golden Horde in Russia, and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia. At first, these divisions maintained loose cooperation, but over time they drifted apart. Local rulers placed their own ambitions above imperial unity. The arteries of trade remained open, but the heart that pumped their lifeblood no longer beat in harmony. Still, in those early decades, the Pax Mongolica brought cultural and scientific ferment. Persian astronomers shared their knowledge in Chinese courts, while Chinese innovations like gunpowder and printing spread westward. Even cuisine reflected the exchange, as new spices appeared in unexpected kitchens. The empire became a corridor not just of goods, but of ideas that would shape the Renaissance in Europe and the future of Asia alike. The irony is that this flourishing was sustained by a system built on conquest and fear. Behind every innovation lay the memory of cities leveled, populations massacred, and dynasties extinguished. The brilliance of the Mongol, Network, cannot be separated from the brutality that created it. For those who lived under Mongol rule, the contradictions were stark. Merchants praised the safety of the roads, but farmers groaned under taxes that funded endless campaigns. Craftsmen flourished when relocated to serve Mongol needs, but they did so in exile, torn from their homelands. Entire communities carried the scars of forced migrations. The empire was at once a facilitator of exchange and a devourer of lives. This duality offers a sobering reflection for America in 2025. The United States secures global trade routes through its Navy and its influence in international institutions. Its power ensures that cargo ships pass safely through straits and that markets remain connected. Yet this security demands enormous expenditure, trillions of dollars over decades, and the burden falls on taxpayers, who may never see direct benefits. Soldiers deploy overseas to guard supply chains, whose profits flow to corporations, not always to the households of ordinary Americans. Like the Mongols, America bears both the pride and the cost of maintaining global order. Stability enriches some, but it strains others. By the 15th century, the Silk Road that had once pulsed with caravans was faltering. The Mongol Empire, which had briefly unified its roots under the Pax Mongolica, had fractured into rival khanates, each taxing and hindering trade. The Black Death had scarred populations and economies across continents. Bandits reclaimed deserts, and the journey that had once promised wealth became once more a gauntlet of danger. Merchants who survived the treacherous paths of Central Asia began to wonder whether another way might exist. Their eyes turned not to the sand, but to the sea. The Indian Ocean, long a theater of coastal trade, now became the stage for a revolution. In global commerce, Arab, Indian, and Chinese sailors had plied its waters for centuries, guided by the monsoon winds that shifted with reliable rhythm each year. Ships laden with spices from Malacca, cotton from Gujarat, and porcelain from China crisscrossed the waves. For a time, these maritime routes complemented the overland Silk Road, feeding goods into its arteries. But as land routes became increasingly unreliable, the sea grew ever more attractive. It promised greater safety, faster transit, and the ability to carry cargoes far heavier than any camel caravan could manage. European powers were the first to grasp how transformative this shift could be. In 1498, Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope and reached Calicut, India, opening a direct sea route that bypassed the Middle Eastern and Central Asian middlemen who had controlled trade for centuries. The consequences were immediate and immense. Portugal, once a small kingdom on the edge of Europe, now stood at the center of a new global system. By seizing strategic ports along the Indian Ocean, Goa, Malacca, or Muscat constructed a maritime empire. No longer did European gold have to flow endlessly eastward along fragile land routes. Ships could now sail directly to the source. For those who had depended on the Silk Road, this was devastating. Cities that had thrived as caravan hubs, Samarkand, Bukhara, Kashgar, found their influence waning. Once vital arteries of commerce dried to trickles, leaving behind fading splendor. Caravanserais emptied, and merchants who had built fortunes on overland trade faced ruin. The deserts that had echoed with the bells of camels grew quiet. The shift to the sea was not gradual. It was a rupture, a turning of the world's axis. Entire economies that had depended on the road's traffic collapsed, while others, perched on coasts and harbors, surged with new life. Yet the sea brought its own perils. Pirates prowled the waters, storms claimed ships, and European cannons turned maritime competition into naval warfare. The Portuguese enforced their dominance with brutality, demanding passes known as cartazes from every vessel and sinking those who resisted. Trade was not freed from danger, was simply reshaped. But the scale of wealth that flowed by sea dwarfed anything the land routes had ever achieved. Silver from the mines of Potosi in the Americas, carried across the Pacific to Manila, flooded into China to pay for silk and porcelain. The first truly global economy was born, and it rested not on desert caravans, but on the creaking hulls of ships. For ordinary people, the consequences were dramatic. Coastal cities swelled with opportunity, while inland towns declined. Sailors faced perilous lives, but some found riches beyond imagination. Meanwhile, communities once enriched by the Silk Road faced poverty and obscurity. The redistribution of wealth was as uneven as it had been in the days of caravans, but its scale was now planetary. The world was becoming connected in a way that no emperor, not even Genghis Khan, had ever achieved. For America, in 2025, the shift from land to sea offers a powerful lesson, just as the Portuguese, Spanish, and later the Dutch and British secured dominance through maritime power. The United States today secures its prosperity through control of global shipping lanes. Aircraft carriers patrol oceans, much as Portuguese. Caravels once patrolled the Indian Ocean. The rise and fall of Silk Road cities remind us how fragile prosperity can be when trade routes shift. In an era where supply chains depend on ocean transit, disruptions whether from piracy, climate change, or geopolitical rivalry can reshape economies overnight. The story of the Silk Road's decline and the sea's ascendancy is a warning that no route, however mighty, lasts forever. The first chapter of maritime dominance had begun, and with it, the overland Silk Road faded into twilight. What had once been the beating heart of Eurasia became a shadow, replaced by the vast highways of the sea. The age of caravans was ending. The age of sails had arrived. If you are still awake, leave a number 1 in the comments. The sea had always been a realm of mystery, but in the 15th and 16th centuries it became the new theater of empire. What caravans of camels could not achieve, fleets of ships now could. The great monsoon winds of the Indian Ocean, long mastered by Arab and Indian sailors, became the invisible engine of a new global economy. Europeans, latecomers to these waters, learned to ride these winds with eagerness and aggression. Their ships carried cannons as well as cargo, and with them came a new model of trade, one backed not only by contracts, but by gunpowder. Portugal led the charge. Vasco da Gama's voyage to Calicut in 1498 was more than a feat of navigation. It was a rupture in history, by reaching India without passing through the traditional Silk Road intermediaries. Portugal broke the centuries-old monopoly of Middle Eastern and Central Asian powers. Within decades, Portuguese fleets seized control of key choke points: Goa, on the western coast of India; Malacca, at the gateway to the Spice Islands; Hormuz, at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. At each port, fortresses rose, bristling with cannons. Trade was no longer negotiated in caravanserais over cups of tea, but enforced at the mouths of guns on the decks of caravels. For Asian merchants who had long dominated the seas, this was a profound shock. Indian, Arab, and Chinese sailors had plied these waters peacefully, guided by seasonal winds and commercial trust. Now they faced a new reality: passes called cartazes, demanded by Portuguese officials, tribute collected under threat, and sudden violence when demands were refused. The seas, once free highways, had become militarized corridors. The overland Silk Road had been dangerous because of bandits in shifting kingdoms. The maritime routes became dangerous because of European navies determined to control every tide. The consequences rippled far inland. Cities that had thrived on caravan trade, Samarkand, Bukhara, Kashgar, saw their markets shrink. The old Silk Road was not abandoned overnight, but its decline accelerated as merchants sought safer, faster, and cheaper routes by sea. The camel caravans dwindled, their bells silenced by the creak of masts and the crash of waves. Desert kingdoms, once wealthy from taxing caravans, slipped into obscurity. Meanwhile, coastal ports such as Goa, Malacca, and later Manila flourished. Wealth shifted from inland hubs to oceanic empires, altering the balance of power across continents. The transformation was not without pain. Inland communities collapsed into poverty, their artisans left without markets. Even along the coasts, wealth was unevenly distributed. Local populations often suffered under Portuguese rule, their trade taxed heavily, their autonomy crushed. Spices and silks enriched Lisbon, but peasants in India and Southeast Asia bore the burdens of foreign dominance. What had once been a shared network of trade became a ladder of exploitation, with European powers climbing upward while many others sank. Yet from this upheaval emerged the first truly global circuits of commerce. Spanish galleons sailed from the Americas laden with silver, crossing the Pacific to Manila, where that silver was exchanged for Chinese silk and porcelain. Portuguese fleets linked Africa, India, and Europe in triangular webs of trade. For the first time, the entire world was stitched into a single economic system, its heartbeat heard not in desert oases, but in coastal harbors. The Silk Road had given humanity its first taste of globalization. The sea routes made it irreversible. The shift from land to sea holds lessons for us today. America, in 2025, depends overwhelmingly on maritime trade. 90% of global goods still travel by ship, passing through strategic choke points like the Strait of Malacca and the Panama Canal. The U.S. Navy ensures the safety of these lanes, much as Portuguese fleets once did. Yet the risks remain. Piracy in the Gulf of Aden, geopolitical tensions in the South China Sea, and the fragility of supply chains exposed during recent global crises. Just as inland cities of Central Asia declined when trade bypassed them, so too do modern industries wither when supply chains shift overseas. The echoes are clear. Those who control the routes of commerce control the destiny of nations. For the merchants of the 16th century, the sea was both salvation and terror. It offered speed, scale, and profit unimaginable in the days of caravans, but it demanded submission to the canons of empire. For the communities left behind in the desert, the sea was a thief, stealing the lifeblood of their markets. The Silk Road did not vanish in a single moment, but by the 16th century, its golden age was over. The waves had triumphed over the sands. If you are still awake, leave a number 1 in the comments. As the 16th century unfolded, the oceans became highways of empires. Portugal's daring voyages had shattered the old order of overland trade, but it was Spain that expanded the revolution to a global scale. With the discovery of the Americas, the world economy was suddenly rewired. The silver mines of Potosi in the high Andes, worked by countless laborers under brutal conditions, poured rivers of bullion into Europe. Yet much of this silver did not stay there. It crossed the Atlantic to Seville, then flowed eastward again on Spanish galleons bound for Manila. From there, it entered Asian markets, traded for silk, porcelain, and spices. The cycle was astonishing. Wealth dug from American mountains financed the treasures of Asian artisans. For the first time in history, Europe, Asia, and the Americas were linked in a single economic rhythm, and the ocean was the conductor. The Manila galleons, as these ships were called, became legendary. Each year they carried silver from Acapulco across the Pacific to Manila, where Chinese merchants eagerly awaited their arrival. In return, silks and porcelains filled the holds for the journey back. The profits were staggering, but so were the risks. Storms could dash a ship to pieces. Pirates could seize its cargo, and countless sailors perished in the grueling crossings. Yet the lure of riches was irresistible. Spanish crowns glittered with American silver, while Chinese markets pulsed with demand. The old Silk Road caravans seemed suddenly provincial compared to these vast armadas. But the benefits were not shared equally. For the indigenous peoples of the Americas, the silver boom meant forced labor and suffering on a scale difficult to fathom. The metasystem in Potosi conscripted entire communities, sending men into mines where they often died within months. The gleam of silk in a European salon, or the shine of coins in a Chinese marketplace, was paid for by the darkness of tunnels in Andean mountains. Prosperity and pain were intertwined, as they so often are in the history of trade. In Asia, too, the shift altered power. Coastal cities thrived, but inland kingdoms declined. Samarkand and Bukhara, once jewels of caravan trade, became relics, their markets shrinking as merchants followed the wealth of the seas. Even mighty Persia, long enriched by its role as middleman between East and West, found itself bypassed. Wealth had shifted, and with it the center of gravity of the world economy. The oceans also transformed warfare. Naval power became the key to empire. Whoever controlled the sea lanes controlled the wealth. Portugal's fortresses, Spain's galleons, and soon the fleets of the Dutch and English turned oceans into battlefields. The Silk Road had always been vulnerable to bandits and shifting alliances. The maritime world was vulnerable to cannons and sails. Empires rose or fell not only by their armies but by their ability to build ships, man them, and defend their routes. The echoes of this transformation are clear in America in 2025. Just as Spain and Portugal once depended on controlling maritime choke points, so too does the United States depend on securing the global commons of today's shipping lanes. Oil tankers passing through the Strait of Hormuz, container ships crossing the Pacific, grain exports moving across the Atlantic are lifelines of modern prosperity. And like the Manila galleons of old, they carry immense wealth, but also immense vulnerability. A single disruption, a conflict, a blockade, a natural disaster can ripple through economies, emptying shelves and driving prices upward. The lesson is ancient but urgent. Global wealth flows along fragile routes, and he who secures those routes holds the balance of power. The story of the Manila galleons and the silver trade also reminds us that prosperity is often built on hidden suffering. The gleaming luxuries of Europe and Asia masked the misery of miners in the Andes and sailors lost at sea. Similarly, today's abundance of goods in American stores, phones assembled in Asia, clothing stitched in Bangladesh, electronics sourced from across the globe, depends on invisible labor in factories far away, often under harsh conditions. The pattern is unchanged. Visible wealth conceals hidden costs. By the 17th century, the Silk Road's decline was undeniable. Caravans still moved, but they were shadows of their former glory. The future belonged to sails and hulls, not hooves and saddlebags. The old road that had once connected empires had been eclipsed by the sea, and the new powers of Europe rose not from desert oases, but from coastal harbors. If you are still awake, leave a number 1 in the comments. By the 17th century, the maritime shift that had begun with Portugal and Spain was no longer theirs alone. New players had entered the stage, and they came not merely as adventurers, but as architects of empire. The Dutch and the English, armed with fleets of ships and the discipline of emerging capitalist institutions, challenged Iberian dominance. They did not simply sail. They organized founding companies that married commerce with conquest. The most famous of these was the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, chartered in 1602, with its own army, navy, and the authority to wage war and make treaties. It was a state in all but name. The VOC and its English rival, the East India Company, turned trade into empire by another name. They seized ports, established colonies, and extracted resources with ruthless efficiency. Spices from the Moluccas, textiles from Bengal, tea from China were folded into networks designed to enrich shareholders in Amsterdam and London. Caravans on the Silk Road could never match the scale of this enterprise. Goods that once trickled across deserts now poured across oceans in quantities vast enough to alter diets, fashions, and economies worldwide. A cup of tea in an English parlor, a sack of sugar in a Dutch bakery, these were the small comforts that revealed an empire's reach. But like the silver of Potosi, this comfort came at a cost. Colonized peoples bore the burdens of forced labor, confiscated lands, and violence. The Banda Islands, source of nutmeg, saw their population nearly exterminated by Dutch soldiers determined to secure a monopoly. Indian weavers who had perfected textiles for centuries found their markets manipulated, their livelihoods disrupted by English policies that favored imported British cloth. The oceans brought prosperity to Europe, but they also brought devastation to those who stood in its path. The inland cities that had once thrived on the Silk Road faded further into decline. Samarkand and Kashgar, whose markets had once glowed with the wealth of caravans, became provincial towns, bypassed by the tides of oceanic commerce. Their decline was not immediate, but it was irreversible. The sands reclaimed what had once been busy routes, and the great caravanserais stood empty, monuments to a world overtaken by sails. For Central Asia, the shift was a slow unraveling of relevance, a reminder that geography, once an advantage, could become a prison when global systems changed. The new maritime empires also altered the very idea of power. Control of the seas meant control of time itself. Caravans might take months to move from China to the Mediterranean, but a fleet could cross oceans in weeks. This acceleration compressed the world, giving European powers leverage not only in trade but in diplomacy and war. The Silk Road had once been the great connector, but now the oceans held that title, and whoever mastered them mastered the future. In America of 2025, the lesson of this transition is particularly sharp. The United States, like the Dutch and English of the 17th century, dominates global commerce, not only through goods, but through the institutions that organize them. Multinational corporations, backed by government power, play roles strikingly similar to the old chartered companies. Shipping routes, digital networks, and financial systems form the new sea lanes, and America's influence depends on keeping them open. Yet just as the Dutch and English discovered, dominance breeds rivalry. China, with its Belt and Road Initiative and expanding naval presence, echoes the challenge once posed by rising powers against Iberian dominance. The struggle is not over caravans and spices, but over semiconductors and energy. Still, the logic is ancient. Whoever controls the routes of commerce controls the destiny of the age. For ordinary people, these global shifts often feel distant, yet personal. A famine in Bengal, caused by British economic policies, meant hunger for millions who never saw a European face. In the same way, a disruption in global supply chains today, whether from war, pandemic, or policy, can empty shelves in American supermarkets and raise prices at gas stations. The mechanics change, but the human experience does not. Prosperity is fragile, and it is always paid for by those furthest from the halls of power. By the 18th century, the transformation was complete. The Silk Road had become a shadow of its former self, its memory preserved in stories and ruins. The oceans had claimed the future. Ships laden with cargo stitched continents together in ways camels never could. Empires rose not from inland strongholds, but from coastal cities bristling with masts and cannon. The axis of history had turned, and the world would never be the same. If you are still awake, leave a number 1 in the comments. By the 18th century, the Silk Road had largely faded into memory, its caravan trails silenced, its markets diminished. The oceans had fully claimed the role of the world's arteries, carrying not only goods, but armies, empires, and ambitions. The Dutch and English East India Companies had perfected a model of trade that blurred the line between commerce and conquest. Wielding both ledger and musket with equal ruthlessness, the Portuguese and Spanish, who had first opened the sea lanes, now found themselves eclipsed by these northern rivals. The center of global power had shifted decisively westward, and the map of the world had been redrawn. The transformation was not only economic, but cultural. Tea became a daily ritual in England, sugar-sweetened diets across Europe, and textiles from India reshaped fashions. What had once been exotic luxuries became ordinary comforts, symbols of how deeply global trade now penetrated everyday life. Yet behind these comforts lay hidden suffering. Enslaved Africans working on Caribbean plantations, Indian farmers coerced into growing export crops, sailors enduring brutal conditions on voyages that circled the globe. The abundance of European households was paid for by the toil and despair of countless unseen lives. The decline of the Silk Road's inland hubs was by then irreversible. Cities like Samarkand and Bukhara, once vibrant centers of exchange and culture, receded into provincial obscurity. Their grand caravanserais and mosques, once humming with traders from across continents, stood half empty, relics of a bygone age. Central Asia, once the beating heart of Eurasian commerce, became a crossroads less traveled, bypassed by the new maritime routes that tied continents together. Geography had turned against them. The deserts and mountains that had once made them indispensable now made them irrelevant. Meanwhile, the seas were crowded with sails and cannon fire. Wars between European powers were no longer fought primarily on land, but across oceans. The Dutch and English clashed in the Anglo-Dutch Wars. Spain defended its American silver fleets from pirates and rivals. France built its own colonial empire, competing fiercely in the Caribbean and India. Oceans became battlegrounds where the fate of nations was decided. The Silk Road had seen its share of wars and bandits, but never had trade been so militarized, so thoroughly entangled with state power. For ordinary people across the globe, these changes were felt in ways both subtle and devastating. A farmer in Bengal might find his grain requisitioned for export while his family starved. A sailor might perish in a storm while carrying tea to London. An African child might be torn from his home and sold into slavery on a Caribbean plantation. These were the invisible costs of a global economy that promised abundance to some and despair to others. Trade had always been unequal, but under maritime empires, the scale of exploitation reached new heights. The parallels to America in 2025 are striking. The United States enjoys a level of abundance unimaginable to earlier centuries. Supermarkets, stocked with fruit from across the world, technology built from minerals mined in distant lands, energy flowing across seas. Yet, like Europe in the 18th century, this abundance depends on fragile systems and hidden costs. Supply chains stretch across oceans, vulnerable to conflict, climate, and competition. Workers in foreign factories labor under conditions unseen by the consumers who benefit. The U.S. Navy, like the fleets of old, secures global trade, but at immense cost in treasure and responsibility. The question remains, is this system sustainable, or will the burden of maintaining it eventually outweigh its benefits? By the dawn of the 19th century, the triumph of maritime routes was complete. The Silk Road lived on in poetry and legend, in the ruins of caravan cities and the faded murals of Dunhuang. But the world had turned decisively toward the sea. Empires, built on sails and cannon, had replaced those built on sand and camel. The age of caravans was over. The age of maritime empires had remade the globe, and yet the memory of the Silk Road endures because it represents more than trade. It symbolizes humanity's urge to connect, to exchange not only goods, but ideas, beliefs, and hopes. Its decline and replacement by sea routes remind us that no system of power lasts forever, that geography and technology can append centuries of tradition in a single generation. For America, in 2025, this is the enduring lesson. The roots of wealth may change, the mediums of power may shift, but the fragility of connection remains constant. The Silk Road gave way to the sea, and one day, the sea may give way to something else: digital networks, space routes, or systems we can scarcely imagine. History whispers that the only certainty is change, and that the greatest empires are those that adapt before the world passes them by. If you are still awake, leave it number 1 in the comments. The story we have followed tonight stretches across 2,000 years. From the Han Dynasty's bold gamble in the deserts of Central Asia to the great maritime empires that finally eclipsed the Silk Road. It is a story of wealth and wonder, of caravans and ships, of monks carrying fragile scrolls and sailors carrying silver across oceans. But above all, it is a story of humanity's restless urge to connect, to reach beyond horizons, to risk danger for the promise of something greater. The Silk Road, in its many forms, is not only history, it is a mirror reflecting the choices and contradictions of our own age. When the Han Dynasty first pushed westward, it discovered that trade is never free. Silk bought allies and prestige, but it also drained treasuries and burdened peasants. The promise of wealth demanded sacrifice, and the empire learned that global connection could both enrich and weaken. In this paradox, we recognize America today. Supply chains bring abundance to households across the nation, yet they also leave workers displaced and communities hollowed. Like the Han farmers who bore the taxes of distant campaigns, ordinary Americans feel the weight of policies that promise global prosperity but often deliver uneven rewards. The Silk Road reminds us that globalization has always been a bargain, and that its costs are borne by those least able to choose them. Rome's encounter with silk revealed another truth: desire can conquer even the mightiest empire. Senators railed against the drain of gold to the east. Philosophers warned that luxury corrupted the soul, yet Rome could not resist. Silk shimmered on its elites, even as the empire's coffers grew thin. In this we hear echoes of modern anxieties. America debates its trade deficits, its reliance on imports, its hunger for goods produced far away. Critics warn of dependence on rivals, of wealth flowing outward, of industries left to decay. Rome's story whispers across time. No empire, however strong, can ignore the balance between what it takes and what it gives. To desire without discipline is to invite decline. And yet, along the Silk Road traveled not only goods, but faiths and ideas. Buddhism crossed deserts into China. Christianity carved its presence in Thames, China. Islam spread with merchants from Arabia to Central Asia. These beliefs reshaped societies, offering meaning as well as conflict. In monasteries and mosques, in hidden caves and crumbling stelae, the legacy of these journeys endures. For us, the lesson is that connection is not merely economic, it is cultural, spiritual, human. America in 2025 is not linked by camels but by digital networks, where ideas flash faster than caravans ever could. With them come the same blessings and dangers: inspiration, division, solidarity, suspicion. The challenge is not new. It is the old question of whether diversity can enrich or whether it will fracture under strain. The Silk Road teaches us that belief adapts, survives, and endures, even when temples fall. The Mongol Empire offers perhaps the most haunting parallel. Genghis Khan's conquest, brutal and vast, created the Pax Mongolica, fleeting order where merchants could travel farther and faster than ever before. For a century, the world felt smaller, its roads safer, its exchanges richer. Yet this peace was built on fear, its foundations brittle. When unity cracked, the system collapsed. Worse still, the very networks that enabled wealth also carried plague, bringing devastation on a scale never before imagined. For modern America, this is a sobering reminder. The global system we inhabit feels durable, but it too rests on fragile foundations. Supply chains can collapse, diseases can spread, alliances can fracture. The same connections that sustain prosperity can deliver catastrophe. The Mongol lesson is clear. Connection is double-edged, and resilience matters as much as reach. Finally, the ocean swept the road aside. The sea routes, seized first by Portugal and Spain, then by the Dutch and English, shifted the axis of the world. Silver from American mines flowed into China. Spices and textiles poured into Europe and inland. Cities once central to the Silk Road withered. Geography, once destiny, became a liability. The world turned toward the coasts, and the caravans faded into silence. For America in 2025, dependent on maritime trade and digital networks, this is more than history, it is warning. No route, however mighty, lasts forever. The Silk Road was replaced by sails. The sea lanes may one day be replaced by cables, satellites, or systems we cannot yet imagine. The question is whether America will adapt before the tide turns. And yet, amid all the rises and collapses, amid the blood and the brilliance, there is hope. The Silk Road's greatest legacy is not its decline, but its endurance. Even in ruins, it reminds us of humanity's hunger to connect, to learn, to share. The goods it carried have turned to dust, but the ideas it spread endure in our religions, our sciences, our cultures. It is proof that even when systems fail, the human spirit persists. So what then does this mean for us? It means that America, in 2025, stands where many empires once stood, at the heart of a global system, enriched by its connections, but burdened by their costs. We face the same questions the Han asked of silk, the Romans of luxury, the Mongols of stability, the Europeans of maritime power. How much can we open ourselves to the world without losing our strength? How do we balance desire with discipline, connection with resilience. These are not new questions. They are ancient, and the Silk Road is their echo. But history is not destiny. Rome's failure is not America's fate. The collapse of the Silk Road is not a prophecy of our own collapse. It is a reminder that choices matter, that adaptation is survival, that the road ahead is never fixed. If the Silk Road teaches us anything, it is that humanity endures by moving forward, by finding new routes when old ones close, by seeking connection even in uncertainty. And so, as we end our journey tonight, let us carry with us the lessons of the road, that wealth is fragile, that ideas are powerful, that connection is both gift and risk, and that resilience is the key to survival. The caravans are gone, the sails have faded, but the spirit of the Silk Road lives on in every attempt we make to bridge divides, to reach across borders, to imagine a world larger than ourselves. If you have listened this far, perhaps you are still awake, perhaps already drifting into sleep. Either way, I thank you for traveling this long road with me. If these stories have stirred your thoughts or given you comfort, I invite you to leave a comment, to share your reflections, to subscribe so that we may continue this journey together. For the road never truly ends, it only changes, and the next chapter, like the last, will be written not only in history books, but in the choices we make today.